Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsan ila yawmiddin. Allahumma ja'alna minhum. Ameen. Thumma ameen. Welcome to all of those online, to all of those that are here with us here in Fatih at Seekers, to the first of a series of seminars. But before we begin with Bismillah, and we begin with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا محمد رسول الله والذين معه أشداء على الكفار رحماء بينهم تراهم ركعا سجدا يبتغون فضلا من الله ورضوانا سيماهم في وجوههم من أثر السجود ذلك مثلهم في التوراة ومثلهم في الإنجيل كزرع أخرج شطأه فآزره فاستغلظ فاستوى على سوقه يعجب الزراع ليغيظ بهم الكفار وعد الله الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات منهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما صدق الله العظيم. Welcome again to all of you, our brothers and sisters, students, teachers, lovers of knowledge. Tonight, as I said, is the beginning of a series of seminars. Seminars that are not necessarily knowledge itself, but beyond that, it is about knowledge, about the structures of knowledge, the structures, and to get the advices of our teachers of what it means to approach these fields and what these fields are, what it means to study them, and most importantly, what it means to benefit from them and for them to be a benefit to us and to others. Our schedule tonight will begin with our presenters and our teachers, Sheikh Dr. Hamza al-Bakri and Sheikh Dr. Omar Qureshi. Sheikh Dr. Omar Qureshi is joining us from the United States, and here we are here in Fatih, Turkey, in Istanbul. We will share a number of questions that we commonly ask as students to our teachers. But very importantly, through the program, as you write down your notes, both those that are online and those that are here, please take the time to write down questions, because there will be time at the end to answer some of our questions if they are not answered during the presentation. And we hope that tonight's program will conclude by about Maghrib time, but we will let the evening go as long as it needs to, inshallah, to get our answers from these very important teachers that we have with us here today. As I said, this series of seminars will cover different fields of knowledge. And we will gain knowledge, of course, ilm, but we will understand how knowledge is organized, what it means to approach it, what it means to study it, what is it that we have to prepare ourselves for in order to truly master and gain the fruit of these subjects. The first of these seminars begins with the study of beliefs and theology, of Aqa'id and Kalam, al-Kalam. It is these subjects which are the foundation of everything. It is the foundation of the Sharia. It is the foundation of our very existence and our belief. But yet, as a subject, they are some of the subjects of the Sharia. Often they can be the most elusive, the most expansive in terms of what to study and the different pathways and progressions, methodologies. And inshallah, in future seminars, as we approach other subjects, we hope that this will provide that foundation. I'd like to introduce our guests, our teachers here with us. Seated with me here is Sheikh Dr. Hamza al-Bakri. Sheikh Dr. Hamza al-Bakri is a prolific scholar, author, and academic, specializing in hadith and kalam. He acquired his PhD in hadith studies from the University of Jordan and is the author of numerous works that are treasured by students of knowledge and academics alike, including his book تعدد الحادثة في روايات الحديث النبوي, with regard to the multiplicity of incidents in narrations of the hadith, as well as a more recent book that he wrote on the nature of the sciences of hadith, and contemporary critical trends. ماهية علوم الحديث والاتجاهات النقدية المعاصرة. Dr. al-Bakri is assistant professor at the Faculty of Theology at Istanbul University and also the chairman of the academic committee of the Tamkeen program here at Seeker's Guidance. He has previously taught at Ibn Khaldun and at Fatih Sultan Mehmed Vakaf University. Joining us is another one of our very dear teachers, someone dear to me. Both tonight are very dear to me. Sheikh Dr. Omar Qureshi is a scholar of the traditional Islamic disciplines and a professional educationalist. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Microbiology, a Master's in Education, and a PhD in Educational Policy Studies. He has also studied the full traditional curriculum of Islamic sciences in Syria, Arabia, and North America. His PhD dissertation was entitled Badr Din ibn Jama'ah and the Highest Good of Islamic Education, treating the topic of educational institutional identity in the United States. Currently, Dr. Qureshi is the Director of Integrated Curriculum at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research and has previously served in numerous capacities, is really one of the pillars of education in the United States. He served as the Provost and Assistant Professor of Liberal and Islamic Studies at Zaytuna College and was also the head of the Contextual Islamic Studies and Leadership Diploma at Cambridge Muslim College. So in the spirit of turning to our guests, we listen to them and we ask questions in the spirit of nasiha. Our deen is nasiha, and we hope that this evening will be a night of advice for us all, whether we're beginning our studies or whether we're in the midst of them or whether we're looking to restart from the very beginning again. And so the first question I have is directed to both our teachers, for it is the beginning of the topic, mastery. That is what the seminar series is about itqan. And so before we talk about mastering ilm al-kalam, let us learn a little bit more about what mastery is. And so what is itqan and what does it mean to truly master a science? And perhaps we can begin on my right-hand side with Dr. Hamza. Tamam, inshallah. With Sheikh Omar, please begin.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can everyone hear?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa habibina maulana wa Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be here in the presence of such individuals like Dr. Hamza al-Bakri. Really, myself, I don't, I'm speaking about mastery of a science which I don't possess mastery of. So I ask everybody's apologies before, first and foremost, inshallah. Um, but to, get into the question, when we're talking about mastery, I think that's an important question to clarify before first, as a first item. And the idea here is when we're talking about itqan or mastery of a science, really what we mean here for our conversation tonight revolves around this idea of al-malaka, which has and al-malaka is the English translation. Usually you find it like translated as habitus, which is a Latin roots for the word malaka, or the Greek, which is hexis. And so sometimes you'll see this also translated merely as habit, right? And but it doesn't mean habit in the sense of, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is such an, uh, maybe I might do some exercises, maybe I might, drink a cup of coffee, or, walk around in the park or something. These habits of life, that's not what's really intended here when they're using the term medica. It is a technical word. And so and we'll talk about in more detail what the word entails. But what we mean here when we're talking about itqan is acquiring a habitus or a malaka. And and so how does that relate to ilm al-kalam? How does that relate to mastering the science of ilm al-kalam? And I think here it's good to start off with what is ilm al-kalam first. And we can use a definition. There's many definitions as one encounters in our tradition about ilm al-kalam, but the definition we can work with today is the definition provided by Aduddin al-Iji, one of the great scholars in the Ash'ari school. And when he defines ilm al-kalam in his mawaqif, he says that it's a science, علم يقتدر معه على إثبات العقائد الدينية بإيراج الحجج ودفع الشبه. So he's talking here about when he provides this definition, he says that the science of Kalam. So it's a science, it's knowledge, it's a discipline of knowledge of many things, and and the knowledge of such things. He doesn't define them exactly yet. He'll get to those what those things are, but it enables a person. Yuqtadaru ma'hu. When a person acquires the knowledge of such things, they're able to do certain things. Yuqtadaru ma'hu. What are those things a person who studies kalam is able to do? What the person's able to do, he lists certain things here. One is ithbatul aqa'id ad-diniyah, is to establish and the establish religious doctrines. All right. So that's something that a person who studies al-Kalam, they are able. The studying the science and mastering the science entails that a person is able to establish religious doctrines. And they usually say that this is religious doctrines, establishing religious doctrines for those who don't believe them, or those who may not hold the very same doctrines. And the second thing he lists here after Ithbatul Aqaid al-Dini, he says, Bi-iraj al-hujjaj. How does one establish religious doctrines? Bi-iraj al-hujjaj, right? And iraj al-hujjaj meaning by adducing arguments. Someone has to be able to furnish and adduce arguments and proofs and evidence is for each of these religious doctrines. This is a pretty wide scope as to what counts as a hujjah or what counts as arguments. And then how does how does a person continue to do this is by, so he mentioned irad al-hujjah, but then he says dafa al-shubah, which is answering objections. Because when you give evidence for the religious doctrines and you make an argument, someone is going to respond to them and object to those arguments, right? And so the idea here is that a person not only is able to give these furnish arguments and deduce proofs, that they're able to respond to the objections to those proofs in a manner that's convincing. So when we're talking about a malaka or mastering al-kalam, and we said that mastery entails acquiring a malaka, and we'll just use the word malaka throughout the evening, not worrying too much about the English translation at this point. Um, then so what is that, that a person, what does mastery entail? Well, mastery entails the things that are mentioned in this definition of ilm al-kalam, which is one has to be able to. Mastery entails being able to establish religious doctrines and furnish not just stating what religious doctrines are, right? Because what we're required to believe, our aqidah, it actually comes from the Quran and Sunnah. And so, what ilm al-kalam is not about what are those religious doctrines. It is about furnishing arguments and proofs for those religious doctrines, right? And then, and when those religious doctrines are, and the arguments that are provided for those religious doctrines, the objections will come about, and therefore has to be able to answer those objections. So mastery or acquiring a malaka entails these things. It entails establishing religious doctrines by adducing arguments and by answering objection to those arguments. And so when that's, I think, a helpful way, hopefully, to start with this idea of what does mastering ilm al-kalam entails. And there's a lot to say about this. And because and I think the conversation we should have, perhaps at least one of the points for tonight is that we should think about is that, okay, as students of Kalam theology, um, what are the activities, what are the that we're involved in when we're studying the science, right? That's something and are these activities uh, going to help us acquire a malaka of the science, as was explained, right now. And so that's a question, we should keep in mind, and I think we'll have some conversations and points to be made about that. So I'll stop there with this, and then we can take the conversation further, inshallah.
The definition. Now we'll turn to Dr. Hamza, inshallah, for this.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أنا في البداية أريد أن أقول أنني سعيد في هذا اللقاء المبارك وأرحب بكم جميعا، وأنا سعيد أن أكون مع أخينا الكريم الدكتور عمر قريشي ومع أخينا الفاضل الدكتور سيد نائل. وأريد أن أبدأ من نفس النقطة التي تكلم فيها الدكتور عمر، وهي أن إتقان العلم يقوم على الملكة، على تحصيل الملكة العلمية في هذا الفن. علماء المنطق يقولون إن العلم يطلق إما على مسائله، وإما على إدراك تلك المسائل، وإما على الملكة التي يحصل بها إدراك تلك المسائل. فعندنا مسائل العلم درجة، إدراك المسائل درجة أعلى منها وأصعب، والملكة التي يمكن للإنسان أن يحصل على الإدراك من خلالها هذه الدرجة الثالثة. والعلم يطلق على الدرجات الثلاث، لكن المحققون من العلماء يقولون أنه على التحقيق هو الملكة كما ذكر الأستاذ.
Dr. Hamza begins by saying how happy he is to be in this gathering here. Of course, a really blessed gathering of great advice. And leaving off where Dr. Omar had spoken about malaka, he said that mastering or having itqan of a knowledge of any science is really understood to be gaining a malaka, which is a word we're going to frequently hear. And he said either this, when we talk about what it means to know a science, either it's understood at three different levels. Either it's the actual issues, the topics themselves, or it's knowledge of the topics themselves and realizing what they are, or it's the third and the highest level, which is having this malaka and this ability, this habitus, this mastery that basically leads one to these topics, to understand them. And that's the muhaqqiqun and the scholars of the highest degree will say that it is really this last and highest level, which what it means when we say knowledge.
وهذا المعنى للعلم لا نجده فقط عند علماء المنطق بمعنى أنه يخص علم المنطق، وإنما هو في فطرة البشر عموما هذا المعنى موجود، بدليل أن بعض المحدثين القدماء الذين لا يدرون ما هو المنطق أصلا كفن قالوا العلم هو الحفظ والفهم، فالحفظ يشير إلى حفظ المسائل، لكن الفهم هو الإدراك. وكيف يحصل هذا الفهم؟ بملكة تعطي هذا الفهم. فنفس المعنى نجده عند بعض المحدثين الأوائل، ذكروا نفس العبارة لكن بمعنى آخر وألفاظ أخرى.
And so when we talk about knowledge, it can be understood as both in terms of memorization or understanding, but and this is not only spoken about, say, in sciences like logic, for example, in mantiq, but Dr. Hamza mentions that also within we find amongst the muhaddithin that the same expression is pointed out here and makes the same point, that it's about it's about knowing things, but it's about understanding things and about gaining mastery to understand the topics and understand the masail.
نعم، والإمام التفتازاني يقول إن الملكة هي كيفية في النفس كيفية، يعني صفة راسخة في النفس تتكيف بها النفس. فيقول إذا قلنا فلان عالم بالنحو، قال التفتازاني ليس مرادنا أن جميع مسائل النحو حاضرة في ذهنه، وإنما نقصد أن له ملكة لاستحضار تلك المسائل إذا احتاج إليها. فكثير من الطلاب يظن أنه إذا يعني قرأ علما من العلوم ومشى على جميع مسائله وحفظها ويعني صار قادر على ترديدها وتكرارها، يظن أنه صار عالما بالفن، ولكن هذا ليس الإتقان. الإتقان كما قال حتى لو غابت عنك تلك المسائل أنت قادر على استحضارها، لأنك أدركت الروابط الخفية بينها، أدركت المنهجية، أدركت القواعد التي خرجت من هذه المسائل والأحكام.
And so many students might think that what we're talking about here is, or somebody that masters a topic or masters a science is somebody that has taken all the masail and all of the subjects and memorized them, and they have them all at their ready to go at any given moment. But in fact, he talks about how Dr. Hamza mentions that Imam Taftazani describes this as a kayfiyya, as a state of being of really the soul of the person, in which they are able to get to and understand and perceive all of the issues, not necessarily have them all present with them at all times. And so it's an ability rather than just a quantitative measure of an amount of knowledge.
أيضا ذكر العلماء في معنى الملكة أن هذه الملكة هي كيفية كما قلنا، كيفية لاستحضار ما هو معلوم ولتحصيل ما هو مجهول. يعني كما ذكرنا أنا ممكن أتعلم الفن، جميع مسائل الفن، ثم أنسى بعضها مع الأيام، لكنني قادر على استحضارها بعد نسيانها، لأنني أدركت الملكة أو أدركت الروابط والمنهجية الكامنة وراء تلك المسائل. هذا استحضار ما هو معلوم، يعني أنت تعلمته ولكنك نسيته، فأنت قادر على استحضاره. لكن الركن الثاني تحصيل ما هو مجهول، يعني لو طرحت مسألة جديدة أمامك لم تمر معك في الكتاب، أنت قادر بإدراك تلك المسائل الأولى وإدراك المنهجية القائمة عليها، تحصيل ما هو مجهول، يعني استخراج حكم للمسألة الجديدة التي لم تمر عليك من قبل.
Another way to look at this ability that a person has is that it's not only to help somebody remember maybe a set of topics, maybe a set of masail that a person forgot, because that can happen. A person may learn something and then forget it, and so it's that ability to go back and remember and revise and bring it back. But beyond that, it's also to then venture out into a space to be able to produce new knowledge. When a new issue is brought up, to be able to go into the unknowns and to be able to provide a knowledgeable and a solid answer to.
طيب قد يقول قائل أين أجد هذه الملكة؟ في أي كتاب هي؟ في أي مستوى من الكتب يمكن أن أجدها؟ نقول لن تجدها ولا في كتاب. هذه الملكة قالوا أصلا هي غير قابلة للتدوين أصلا، لأنها كيفية للنفس كما قلنا، يعني ليست عبارة وليست ألفاظ، إنما هي يعني معنى من المعاني، كيفية للنفس كما قلنا. يعني النفس تتكيف بها، يعني يصبح أنت عندك صفة. كيف عندي صفة البصر، عندي صفة السمع، عندي صفة فهم هذا العلم. فهي من كثرة تكرار مسائل العلم ومناقشة الأستاذ ومتابعة الدروس والمذاكرة وكذا، يعني يفهم الإنسان ما هي الروابط بين المسائل. كاللغة، كيف الطفل ويسمع ألفاظ لا يسمع قواعد اللغة، ولكنه من كثرة سماعه للألفاظ من والديه يدرك أنه هذا يعني بين هذه اللفظة وتلك اللفظة في رابط. مثلا نسبة الفاعل إلى الفعل، يدرك الرابط الإسنادي بين الفعل والفاعل، وهكذا. هذا يكتسبه من الممارسة وليس بالتدوين. فالملكة لا تقبل التدوين أصلا، وإنما تكتسب بكثرة ممارسة الفن.
And so a student might ask, we might ask, where can this ability be acquired? How can it be developed? Maybe there's a book to read about it, but this is not found in any books. It's actually, it resists the ability to be codified, to be able to be put down in writing. It actually is a meaning, it's an attribute that becomes part of you, just like you have sight, just like you have understanding. It's an attribute of you as an individual, of your soul. Consider how a child learns language. They're not, when they learn the language and they see words coming together and sentences coming together, and they're seeing predication between the subject and the doer the subject and the verb, and they're seeing these connections. They're seeing them. It becomes part of who they are. They're not looking at them as rules anymore. And so the only way that this malaka ultimately gets developed is by mumarasa, is by practicing and applying this craft. And perhaps this is what we'll get to explore more as the evening progresses, is what does it mean to practice.
وأخيرا حتى لا أطيل في هذه النقطة، أريد أن أنبه على عبارة مهمة جدا للإمام الغزالي في هذا السياق. الإمام الغزالي يقول في مواضع من كتبه، يعني ذكر هذه العبارة في كتاب الاقتصاد في الاعتقاد في 3 أو 4 مواضع، وذكرها في كتاب إحياء علوم الدين، وذكرها في كتاب المستصفى، وذكرها في كتاب معيار العلم، وذكرها في مشكاة الأنوار، وذكرها في المقصد الأسنى في شرع أسماء الله الحسنى. يعني في 6 كتب بما يزيد على 10 مواضع ذكرها. العبارة قد تختلف من كتاب لكتاب، ولكن حاصل معناها أن الغزالي يقول أكثر الأغاليط إنما تنشأ من طلب المعاني من الألفاظ. يعني الإنسان يتمسك بالألفاظ ويصبح بحثه يدور على الألفاظ، ويحكم عليك بالصواب أو الخطأ تبعا لللفظ الذي نطقت به، ويحكم على مثلا فلان أنه خالف مثلا قول العلماء تبعا لللفظ الذي نطق به، ويظن أن المسألة تدور صحة وخطأ وصوابا وفسادا مع لفظها. ولكن العلم ليس تابعا للألفاظ، وإنما هو تابع للمعاني. لذلك يقول أكثر الأغاليط إنما تنشأ من طلب المعاني من الألفاظ، يعني التمسك باللفظ لطلب المعنى، وإنما المطلوب منا أن ندرك المعاني ثم نعبر عنها بالألفاظ المناسبة. فلو إنسان أخطأ في اللفظ نقول أخطأت في اللفظ، لكن المعنى عندك صحيح. هذه المعاني التي يشير إلى غزالي هي الملكة التي نقصدها في هذا المجال. إتقان الفن يقوم على إدراك هذه المعاني.
Imam Ghazali has a very poignant expression on this topic of malaka, which he mentions in a number of times in his iqtisad, in the mustasfa, in Maqsid al-Asna, in his commentary on the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on Mi'yar al-Ilm, in a number of his books. And this expression says that most mistakes happen because people are trying to extract meanings from taking the meanings from the words, and they're trying to follow the words very carefully, the outward expression, and they're getting stuck on the outward expression. They're not descending to the level actually of the meanings, because at the level of, and they might judge whether something is valid or whether it's invalid purely based on the outward expression of it, because they haven't encountered it enough in order to descend to the level of meanings. Those meanings haven't become a part of them, and so they're not able to judge based on knowledge where it really rests, which is in the level of meanings, and instead they're stuck at the level of words. Alhamdulillah. So I think we've been able to get a clearer sense of what mastery is, and it's this lofty goal and maybe even nebulous at this stage, but inshallah it will become clear as the evening goes on. Dr. Omar, you spoke about the definition of knowledge and what a helpful thing that is to go into any science with, to be able to understand what are the outcomes that we're expected to do, what are we expected to do. But with regard to ilm al-kalam, what is it that makes it worth pursuing mastery in this science? It's a discipline that sometimes has even been debated, even contested in terms of its place in the Islamic sciences, just by the way in which the words are often used, Aqa'id or ilm al-kalam. But could you help us understand and expand on the fawaid of ilm al-kalam, on its benefits, particularly in our current day? What greater purpose does it serve, and why should a student of knowledge invest deeply in it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is building on the point that I think that's mentioned so far, which is that there is a difference when we're talking about mastery and malaka between knowing principles and of a science and knowing its guidelines of a science, right? And just studying a science in books, and then the malaka, right? So this difference, الفرق بين مجرد دراسة العلم والملكة. This is an important difference. I think that's is to highlight here. And so if we're going to speak about, well, mastery of ilm al-kalam, right, entails what we talked about in the definition, that, which is a good starting point, which is establishing religious doctrines by adducing arguments and answering objections. Yeah, then I think it's good to get into some detail about what it entails. What are the uh, what are ways this manifests? What are further details of ilm al-kalam? And here, we can look at what scholars talk about the goods of ilm al-kalam, the fa'idatu ilm al-kalam, right? And there's multiple. Some will say, some scholars will list two, some will list three, some will list five, some will list 10. There's multiple, discussions on what the fawaid of ilm al-kalam, what the goods of ilm al-kalam entail. But again, we'll rely on our very formidable scholar Imam al-Iji for this, and where he says in the Mawaqif, the first good he mentions is, he says الترقي من حضيض التقليد إلى ذروة الإيقان, which is that a student, and this is a benefit on an individual, right, of studying the science of kalam, which is that an individual person who's studying this science will leave this state of taqlid, right, of believing in things merely because, or based on received, doctrines and what a person is taught in class, and not critically examining them. And they will now hold their beliefs with evidences and with critical examination, and not just merely on the authority of the instructor. Um, and so this leads to the student to have certainty then, a level of a degree of iqan, not itqan, but iqan, right? And so this is an important, this is the first good that of the science, studying the science of kalam, that Aliji mentions, right? And then the second good is not a personal one, but it's this is a good in relation to one considering other people. And so he says that as a second good is إرشاد المسترشدين بإيضاح المحجة وإلزام المعاندين بإقامة الحجة. And so here you're able to guide those who are seeking answers to their questions. And how do you do this? By clarifying and giving proofs, right, for people who have questions about religion and questions that relate to religious doctrines. And of course, that's, and then also to, hold and to answer objections of those people who are not, are seeking to refute, right, religious doctrines. And so, because every time a person has a question, they probably listen to objections to religious doctrine. So first aspect is to clarify what is it that we actually believe and are required to believe in as Muslims. And second of all, then to answer the objections that individual might have come across, and that's causing them to have some questions here. And so this is an important aspect, but now this is a benefit of ilm al-kalam for the other person, not the individual studying it. So, but the individual now can be of service, right, to the ummah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And the third good he says is that حفظ قواعد الدين عن أن تزلزلها شبه المبطلين. So here you're going to also you're going to maintain and preserve and protect, right, the foundations of the religion, because the foundations of all sciences, as will come, one studies kalam, is ilm al-kalam. So the foundations of fiqh, of hadith, right, of usul al-fiqh, all of these other sciences, the basis for them is ilm al-kalam theology. And so by protecting and the foundations of this, the religion is also protected, right, against people who would try to refute Islam and the doctrines that Muslims hold to be true. And then the fourth, he says, is that this kind of, we've already spoken about, is where all the other Islamic sciences, right, are built upon and take from ilm al-kalam. But so logically, first, if you're studying hadith, you're studying the words of a person who you believe to be a prophet, right? Well, hadith science doesn't establish, right, the truthfulness of the claim of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. It's ilm al-kalam that establishes that, right? And so what here it means is that all the Islamic sciences assume the deliverables and the conclusions of ilm al-kalam. And so in hadith we're assuming that we make the assumption, and we're going with the assumption that this person whose words we're studying is only speaks the truth and is a true prophet. Well, what science establishes that? That's ilm al-kalam. So ilm al-kalam helps us understand also the relationship of the Islamic sciences towards each other, and that's an important good. And then the fifth, is relates to a person's intentions. E.g., says sihhatul niyya wa sihhatul i'tiqad, right? And then by this, a person obtains the eternal happiness, right, both in this world, and in the hereafter. So here, what this, so these goods. So, like, why are we talking about these goods? Well, because when you're talking about acquiring a malaka, one should be a mastery of a science. Well, mastery of a science entails making sure that we obtain these five goods. There are other more than five that one can find, but at least these five goods one should be seeking to obtain mastery in as well. And so if one is not, and so this kind of deepens our conversation of what is mastery of the science means. And so we can add on that these are ways that mastery will be manifested in these other areas of life as well, and the life of a mutakallam as well. And so when we're talking about these goods here, what's important here, to build on a point that Sheikh Hamza mentioned, which is that you don't find Malaka in a particular book, right? And I think this is an important point, because to spend some time on is that Malaka does not mean knowledge. Malaka does not mean knowledge of the principles and information of a particular science, right? That's not what Malaka entails. In fact, and oftentimes we, especially if you look at the education of Islamic sciences in our time, many students and teachers, they confuse the studying of books with Malaka. So what does that mean is that, well, if I just study these books, then I'll be able to get a Malaka, right? I'll acquire it after studying these books. Or if I just, the goal for me is now to study the most advanced, the most cryptic text, and understand, the commentaries, understand the hawashi, the glosses on them, on these texts. And, so I busy myself with that. And therefore I'll obtain mastery of a science. Well, I think the conception of mastery as Husul al-Malaka presented today it kind of shows, no, that's not how you obtain mastery, right? You actually have to be doing things, right, with it. And that's the thing to focus on. So what ends up happening now, unfortunately, is that students and teachers confuse the means, right, which is studying texts and things like this, with the end, which is a malaka. And what happens is the studying text becomes the means. And then, where in fact, no, studying text and doing all of other activities, those are just means, right? And we cannot forget the actual malaka itself, and that's why it's important to distinguish between the two. And so many times we think, if I just study for 8, 10, 15 years, I'm just studying text. I'm studying text, and now I'm going to the next advanced text, and then the next advanced text, and then I'm going to gain mastery of the science. No, that's not what's going to happen here. You're just going to get better at reading text. But reading text is not what Kalam's about, right? Everything we talked about so far, right? What our scholars have said about Kalam is about إثبات العقائد الدينية. Nowhere does Al-Easy says, يعني إتقان قراءة الكتب, right? That's not the goal of Ilm al-Kalam, and that's not what Ilm al-Kalam is about. Ilm al-Kalam is about إثبات العقائد الدينية, and how about إرادة الحجج ودفع الشبهة. So one has to be involved in those things, right? Yeah. So yeah, I'll stop there for this question, inshallah.
Because it's often a common misconception or a common conception to say that it's that m- that it's just a series of books that one has to read, and then it's like it's a series of levels, and that's what corresponds to one's advancement. But a question I would have for Dr. Hamza is malaka, is mastery one sort of thing, or are there different levels to it? Are there different maratib to it? Is there different kinds of mastery? Or does somebody wake up one day and they're one kind of master, especially with regard to ilm al-kalam?
نعم، يعني لا شك أن كل علم من العلوم ينقسم إلى مراتب متعددة. والإمام الغزالي في أول كتابه إحياء علوم الدين يذكر أن لكل علم من العلوم 3 مراتب: مرتبة الاقتصار، ومرتبة أعلى وهي الاقتصاد التوسط يعني، ومرتبة أعلى وهي الاستقصاء، هكذا يسميها الغزالي. وفي الحقيقة هو نظر إلى يعني وسط وطرفين، طرف أدنى وطرف أعلى وطرف متوسط، فقال الاقتصار يعني الطرف الأدنى، والاقتصاد المتوسط، والطرف الأعلى الاستقصاء. ولكن يعني منطق هذا التقسيم أيضا، يعني نحن كما قلنا لا نريد أن نتتبع الألفاظ، يعني فلسفة هذا التقسيم أن هناك مراتب للعلم، فأيضا المرتبة الدنيا يمكن أن نقسمها إلى مراتب، والمرتبة الوسطى يمكن أن نقسمها إلى مراتب، وهكذا. فإذا العلم مراتب لا حصر لها، يمكن تقسيم كل مرتبة من مراتب العلم إلى مراتب تفصيلية، والإتقان يتعدد بتعدد هذه المراتب. فكل من أتقن رتبة من المراتب وارتقى إلى الرتبة التي أعلى منها فقد أتقن مستوى من مستويات العلم، وأتقن مرتبة من مراتبه. ولكن يعني عرفا لا يسمى الشخص متقنا للفن إلا إذا يعني تعدى المراتب الدنيا إلى أعلى المراتب الوسطى، يعني جاوز الوسط بقليل فبدأ يعني عرفا في حد الإتقان، وإذا وصل إلى الاستقصاء فهذا يعني أفضل ما يكون.
So every knowledge ultimately has levels by itself, let alone talking about mastery. But knowledge itself divides into many different levels. When we see how Imam Ghazali in the Ihya divides knowledges and sciences, he'll say that a science has 3 levels, and so he points out 3 levels. This basically a beginner level, intermediate level, and an advanced level. But Dr. Hamza cautions us to say it's not just about just the names of these levels and the fact that there's 3 levels. It's just the idea that there are numerous levels, and mastery will correspond to each of those levels wherever they are. Within the intermediate level, there are numerous levels, and so a person is always on a continuum. They're always traveling. And so that's the philosophy behind when we look at knowledge, that we don't look at it as one entity. It's something that we're continuously growing with. When we use the word master in our current day, usually this refers to somebody that has reached the upper intermediate levels. But that's just something that's customary amongst us. But remember what Dr. Hamza said earlier, that mastery can apply to all of those levels, technically.
أتابع. لذلك الإمام الغزالي مثلا كتب في المستوى الأول كتاب قواعد العقائد في علم الكلام. في المستوى المتوسط كتب الاقتصاد في الاعتقاد وسماه بنفس اسم المرتبة الاقتصاد. في المرتبة العليا لم يكتب كتابا سوى تهافت الفلاسفة يمكن أن نقول، وبث ممكن نقول أفكاره في ذلك في كتبه المتفرقة. غير الإمام الغزالي كذلك فعل، يعني علماؤنا كتبوا كتب متدرجة، لكن الملاحظة المهمة في ذلك أنه لو قارنا مثلا بين قواعد العقائد للغزالي والاقتصاد في الاعتقاد للغزالي لا نجد الارتفاع في المستوى في عدد المسائل فقط أو في زيادة مسائل يعني لا تصلح للمبتدئ وإنما تصلح للمتوسط، لكن نرى نفس المسائل المشتركة بين الكتابين فيها عمق في البحث وعمق في الأسئلة والأجوبة، عمق في التفكير أكثر من المستوى السابق. فليس الفرق بين المستوى والمستوى في عدد المسائل أو زيادة مسائل جديدة فقط، هذا موجود، لكن نفس المسائل أيضا تطرح بطريقة أعمق في كل مستوى عن المستوى السابق.
So if we look at what Imam Ghazali wrote, he wrote books basically at those three levels. So we know his Qawaid al-Aqa'id, we know that his intermediate book is actually called Iqtisad, right, related to the intermediate level that he names. And then if we consider Tahafut if we consider that to be the upper level, then you would have these three levels. And the difference between each of these books is not in the number of topics that they address, but rather, although it could be the case that there are additional issues that are brought up, but it really is in the depth of the answers and the different lines of thinking that are brought forth as the books move to different levels.
الآن أنا كدارس لهذا العلم كطالب علم كيف أصل إلى الإتقان في هذه المراحل في هذه المراتب؟ نقول أنت أيضا في كل مرتبة من هذه المراتب عليك عدد من الوظائف، عليك عدد من الغايات التي تريد أن تصل إليها. فيعني الغاية الأولى لطالب العلم في مرتبة من المراتب أن يقرر المسألة، يعني أن يكون قادرا لو سئل عن المسألة بعد أيام أو بعد سنة أن يكون قادرا على تقريرها، ليس بإعادة نقل نفس الألفاظ إنما التعبير عنها بألفاظ جديدة لكن نفس المحتوى. هذه مرتبة التقرير نسميها، وهي يعني إحدى الوظائف المطلوبة، وهي نوع من الإتقان في هذا الفن. مرتبة أعلى من ذلك وهي مرتبة تقرير المذاهب الأخرى، كما أنا قادر أن أقرر قولي ومذهبي في المسألة، أنا قادر أن أقرر أقوال المخالفين. هذه مرتبة أعلى. وظيفة ثالثة ومرتبة ثالثة أن أكون قادر على تحرير محل الخلاف، يعني أين الخلاف بالضبط بيننا وبينهم، لأن الخلاف يصور في الكتب خلاف في جوانب كثيرة، ولكن في النهاية يؤول هذا الخلاف إلى نقطة مركزية هي السبب في الخلاف الرئيسي. فإذا يعني عالجنا هذه المسألة وضح لنا لماذا افترقت المذاهب في هذه القضية. سأكمل بعد ما نعم.
And so when a student approaches these books and approaches the sciences, what should they be able to do? We spoke earlier about outcomes, and Dr. Hamza urges us to think about this, that there are certain responsibilities that we have and certain certain abilities that we should be able to possess. One of them, the most basic level, is that after some period of time, if a student's asked about the issue, they should be able to outline and establish the question at hand that was discussed in the book, not necessarily in the exact words of the book, but to be able to outline in terms of, as a question, what was it, what was the answer. A level above this is to be able to do this and to take the other positions of perhaps of other schools of thought and to be able to outline those, again, not necessarily in the words that we found them, but are able to bring them forth and outline them as topics and questions and evidences. And at the third level, it's to be able to identify the exact point of difference between these different schools, between perhaps the school that one takes and the other schools, to be able to really pinpoint what is the issue at stake here between these positions, and that we're not just reading the book as merely a list of positions.
نعم كذلك كما قلنا التقرير وتحرير، ومن الوظائف والمراتب المهمة لطالب العلم ليحصل على الإتقان هي تحقيق المسألة. تحقيق المسألة يعني القدرة على إثبات ما تريد منها، يعني إثبات قولك، إثبات ما تراه صحيحا بالأدلة. يعني أنت قادر أن تقيم الأدلة على صحة قولك وعلى إبطال قول المخالف، ولو وجه عليك اعتراض على قولك أنت قادر على أن تجيب عنه. هذا تحقيق المسألة. من المراتب أيضا والوظائف والتي يعني تدل على إتقان الفن عند الدارس أنه قادر على الفصل بين جهات المسألة المتعددة. يعني مسألة واحدة لكن البحث فيها من عدة جهات، هو قادر أن يفصل بينها. يعني قادر أن يقول هذه المسألة البحث فيها مثلا من 3 جهات، الخلاف بيننا مثلا وبين المعتزلة من جهة، بيننا وبين مثلا الكرامية من وجه آخر، فالنقاش مع المعتزلة يكون بطريقة، النقاش مع الكرامية يكون بطريقة أخرى، وإن كان نفس القول لي، ولكن يعني محل النزاع مع المعتزلة من طرف، محل النزاع مع الكرامية من طرف آخر، فلا ينبغي الخلط بينهما. كذلك قد يكون مثلا أقول مثلا للمخالف دليلك صحيح، لكن محل نزاعك معي ليس في هذه النقطة. يعني المحل النزاع بيني وبينك ليس فيما تستدل به، أنا قادر أن أفصل بين يعني صحة الدليل وعدم دلالته على محل النزاع على سبيل المثال. هذه مرتبة أعلى وأصعب. ومن أصعب ما يكون في الإتقان هو الاشتباك مع المذاهب الأخرى، خصوصا المذاهب المستجدة، المذاهب المعاصرة. هذا من أصعب ما يكون في إتقان العلم، أن تكون قادر على نقل العلم من مستوى المدون إلى مستوى المعاصر، أن تكون قادر أن تشتبك مع المذاهب المعاصرة وتوظف ما تعلمت في ذلك. هذا من أعلى مراتب الإتقان في الفن.
And so moving from the earlier levels that were described, where it's just about being able to identify what the actual issue was, and then being able to identify the issue is with regard to other positions, and then with regard to what is the actual point of difference, the next level beyond that is tahqiq, or has been described as verification, as being able to be able to marshal the evidences for your position, to be able to anticipate arguments or questions that will be made against that position, and then to be able to argue against them, as from the definition also we heard from Dr. Omar earlier, and 2 other points that Dr. Hamza made, which are very important. He said, number 1 is that a teacher should be able to, in treating any given topic, should be able to say, this is a topic that we're going to discuss from 3 different perspectives, perhaps on the same issue. We have to think about how our position interacts with the position of the Mu'tazila or the Karramiyya or any other given group, and perhaps there may be a different kind of argument, a different kind of answer that's needed because of the difference of the point of difference, right? The mahall al-niza' that is with regard to each of these groups. And so a person should be able to then be in a position where when their opponent gives an argument, they should be able to distinguish between the validity of that argument or validity of that evidence, but to say, okay, that evidence might be valid, but it doesn't signify, it doesn't treat or address the actual point of difference that we're having. And so we have to be able to see where the arguments are moving, where the evidences are moving. Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. I think that we have a lot to think about in terms of mastery, both in terms of the outcomes we heard from the definition, as well as the goods that were described, the fruits, the fawaid of where we need to go, and the advices that we just heard with regard to these very, very detailed abilities that we need to be able to have as we carefully approach our studies and think about what we're able to do with what we learn. We're going to move to another theme now, which is when we talk about mastery or malaka, we also hear another term within this sphere, which is the shakhsiyya ilmiya, the scholarly character of this personality. And so, Dr. Hamza, we've been speaking more up until now about really the knowledge itself and ilm and what it means to treat it. But there is also the human dimension to it, the person, we, the students who are studying. And so, what is this shakhsiyya ilmiya, and what are its defining characteristics in ilm al-kalam specifically and in the pursuit of knowledge generally?
طبعا يعني كل علم من العلوم يحتاج إلى بعض الصفات، بعض الخصائص في دارسه. هناك شروط عامة لكل العلوم، يعني العلم يحتاج إلى صبر، يحتاج إلى اجتهاد، يحتاج إلى مذاكرة، إلى مثابرة، إلى آخره. لكن نحن لا نتكلم في هذا السياق، وإنما نتكلم في سياق يعني إتقان علم الكلام تحديدا. فما هي الخصائص الخاصة بطالب علم الكلام أو بدارس علم الكلام أو الباحث في علم الكلام حتى يصير متقنا لهذا الفن؟ الأمر الأول هو الأهلية الخاصة بعلم الكلام. كل العلوم تحتاج أهلية واستعداد، لكن علم الكلام يحتاج إلى أهلية خاصة تناسبه، وهي هذه الأهلية تقوم على يعني قابلية سماع الشبهات أيا كانت، لأن علم الكلام قائم على أن تسمع جميع الشبهات وتفكر في جميع الشبهات وتحل هذه الشبهات وتجيب عنها. فلا بد أن يكون طالب علم مستعد لأن يسمع جميع الشبهات، وأن يكون محصنا لنفسه بحيث لا يتأثر بها، فيكون عنده يعني قوة شخصية بحيث أنني قادر أن أسمع أي شبهة في هذا الفن، حتى لو كانت على أصل وجود الله تعالى، حتى لو كانت على وحدانية الله، حتى لو كانت على صدق الأنبياء، لكن في نفس الوقت أنا محصن نفسي جدا بحيث لن أتأثر بهذا، بل سأقوم بحلها والجواب عنها بإذن الله تبارك وتعالى.
So there are some characteristics, some qualities that are needed in any given path in life, in any science, right? Like patience and working hard. But with regard to ilm al-kalam specifically, there are some that are very specific to it. And one of them is the state of preparation that a person really has to be in. And what does it mean to be prepared for it? And that preparedness comes down to being able to listen and entertain very doubtful matters and listen to these arguments that are being made that are perhaps against the most sensitive and most precious beliefs that a person has, and to be able to listen to them, think about them very carefully, and craft an answer to them, but at the same time taking the necessary precautions so they're not affected or influenced by them. They have to have a thick skin.
أيضا هذا العلم يحتاج إلى أهلية من جهة أن تكون عقلية هذا الدارس عقلية فلسفية. بمعنى أقصد بالعقلية الفلسفية أن يكون يعني قادر أن يبحث في الماهيات، في الحقائق المجردة، بأن يعزلها عن الواقع الذي يعيشه. يعني أنا لا أريد أن أدرس هذه المسألة من خلال الواقع الذي أعيش فيه، بل أنا أريد أن أجرد المسألة من واقعها وأحكم عليها، لأن علم الكلام قائم على الأحكام العقلية، الواجب عقلا والممكن عقلا والمستحيل عقلا. فهذا لا يدرس من خلال الواقع، وإلا وقعنا في الواجب عادة والمستحيل عادة، وإنما نحن نريد أن ندرس الحقيقة كما هي مجردة. فهذا الأمر التجريدي ليس كل الناس يعني مخلوق بحيث يستسيغه. بعض الناس يعني لا يحب الدخول في هذا، حتى لو كان قادر عليه، ربما هو قادر أن يفعله، لكن إذا فعله يجد ضغط نفسي على شخصيته، يجد أنه انقبضت نفسه، يجد أنه غير مرتاح. يقول أنا مرتاح عندما أعيش مع الناس وأدرس أحوالهم وأدرس خصائصهم وصفاتهم وكذا. إذا أنت يعني خلقت وميسر، كل ميسر لما خلق له، أنت ميسر لطرف آخر، لست لهذا الفن.
Another unique characteristic is that a person is to have to a certain degree a philosophical mindset. What does this mean? This means that a person cannot be stuck in the material reality that's around them. They have to be ready to be able to denude the world as it is and look at the question and look at the mas'ala abstracted from the world that's around them. And a person might actually have the ability to do it, but maybe they just don't want to do it. Maybe they just feel a discomfort and they'd rather hang out with people, study things that are right there in front of them. And so this mindset and the ability and the desire to exercise this mindset is another very important part of the recipe of mastery.
وهناك أمر آخر في شخصية دارس هذا الفن، وهو أن يكون لديه رغبة حقيقية. لا أتكلم عن الرغبة العامة، وإنما أتكلم عن رغبة حقيقية لدراسة علم الكلام. لأن بعض الناس ينجرف مع الرغبة المعاصرة أو السياق المعاصر، أو بين قوسين ما نسميه الموضة. يعني الناس مندفعون في هذه الآخر 5 سنوات لعلم الكلام، فالكل صار مندفع فهو اندفع معهم. يعني في قبل 20 سنة مثلا ما كان التوجه لعلم الكلام كما هو اليوم. اليوم في رغبة عند الناس بشكل عام، في توجه عالمي يعني عند الشرق والغرب إلى يعني دراسة علم الكلام. فبعض الطلاب بعض الدارسين ينجرف مع الواقع، لكن لم يراعي هل شخصيته صالحة لذلك أم ليست صالحة لذلك. فلا بد أن يكون عنده رغبة حقيقية وليس انجراف مع الرغبة العامة المعاصرة.
And often a person might take on a subject or pursue it only because it's the fad of the time. It's what everybody else is doing. If you think about just two decades ago, the kind of interest that we currently see and witness in ilm al-kalam was not present. And so it's not to say that now go to find something else, but a person has to have a real desire for it. It can't just be a desire that is reflected in the winds of time that they're experiencing at that moment.
وأخيرا هناك شيء مهم في هذا المجال، وهو ما يمكن أن نسميه بالتواضع بالعلم. التواضع يعني بسبب العلم، التواضع بسبب علم الكلام. يعني ينبغي على طالب علم الكلام حتى يصل إلى الإتقان أن يتعاهد نفسه ويذكر نفسه بالتواضع بسبب علم الكلام. لماذا؟ لأن علم الكلام كما قلنا هو قائم على تجريد الحقائق، البحث يعني الحفر في الماهيات، وليس البحث في القشور الظاهرة. فهذا يجعل شخصية الدارس شخصية عميقة التفكير. فهو عندما ينظر إلى تفكير الناس بعد ذلك يرى تفكير الناس نوعا ما بمقارنة ما هو يفكر فيه قد يراه تفكيرا سطحيا. أنتم تفكرون في المسألة من قشورها، أما أنا أفكر المسألة من باطنها من عمقها. أنتم تفكرون في المسألة من جهة أو جهتين، كما قلنا من إتقان علم الكلام أن تفصل المسألة من جهات كثيرة وتقول من هذا الطرف نحكم عليها بكذا، ومن هذا نحكم عليها بكذا، ومن هذا الجهة نحكم عليها بكذا. فهو يجد نفسه يعني تجاوز تفكير الناس بمراحل، فهذا يورث في نفسه الكبر، يجعله متكبرا على الناس، مستسخفا لعقول الناس، مستهزئا بعقول الناس. فإذا لم يذكر نفسه بالتواضع بالعلم، هذا الكبر يحجبه بعد مدة عن رؤية الحقائق، يحجبه عن التفكير، لأنه صار متكل على أنه أفهم من الناس وأذكى من الناس وأكثر قدرة على يعني إظهار الحقيقة من الناس، فيكسل مرة أخرى. فيصبح بدأ أن يفكر جميع أطراف الناس يفكر من جهة واحدة، فيقع في الأغلاط السخيفة جدا التي لا يتصور من مثله الكبير أن يقع في مثلها. وهذا رأيناه عند بعض يعني النقاشات الكلامية، عندما يناقش مثلا أهل السنة بعض الآراء مثلا عند بعض المعتزلة أو بعض الفلاسفة، مع كون المعتزلة والفلاسفة من أذكياء العالم، وفعلا هم أذكياء البشر يعني، لكن وقعوا في أخطاء من أسخف ما يكون أحيانا. أحد أسباب ذلك هو هذه النقطة، والله أعلم.
A person who studies ilm al-kalam has to be on guard because of the nature of the science and what it leads a person to do. What does it lead a person to do? It's ilm al-kalam is a deep reflection. It's a deep archaeology in the nature of things. It's not an archaeology into the soil of the earth or into things that we usually deal with. And so it leads somebody to become a very deep and contemplative thinker. And that can make one, when you're going about in hearing daily conversations, and you're speaking to others, one might start to think that line of thinking is so superficial, and there are so many deeper ways to think about it, and this can lead to arrogance, And this arrogance, Dr. Hamza warns us, is is critical not only because of of uh, of what it might mean in the next world, but it also is because that it's that arrogance which will veil us from seeing the reality of things as they are, and will lead those that even they might be the most cerebral and the most contemplative of thinker, can lead them to great mistakes. And he says, look no farther than the Mu'tazila, who were intelligent beyond intelligence, but yet they fell into great error. And so a person may have great ability, but because of that arrogance, they will be veiled and they will commit error. And so this brings up something very unique about ilm al-kalam, as we see that there are things that are very specific about it that may be different and shared only to some degree with other sciences. But Dr. Omar, when a student opens a book of fiqh, there is a certain way he reads it, a certain posture he takes toward the text. Is that the same method that we should approach our books then with when we're reading ilm al-kalam? It's a science, it's based on reasoning, on argument, counter-argument. Is there something that it demands us to do differently, a different critical eye that we have to have when we're reading it?
Bismillah. It's a great question. And it relates back to what Dr. Hamza was saying about the different levels of mastery. And so, at the level of taqrir, for example, one will seek, the goal of that level is to really understand and have a proper conception of the different topics and issues and the doctrines that are being taught, and to understand them correctly. And so at that level, yes, you really want to, it's a level of just getting a proper understanding of the things. However, when you're going beyond this level, right, there are certain, different approaches are required, right, to take. And as we know, for example, yes, in fiqh, taqlid is something that is required in the sense that, like the people who are studying it initially, they don't have the qualifications of ijtihad, and they're pretty lofty qualifications of ijtihad. But the distinction between taqlid and ijtihad it's a spectrum, right? It's not either or. And there are degrees of taqlid and there's degrees of ijtihad as well, right? So that needs to be kept in mind. When it comes to ilm al-kalam, of course, taqlid has a different conception, right, and a different perspective. And here, because it's a rational science and it's based on rational proofs, and also it's based on transmitted proofs, the focus is on proofs and not just uncritically accepting a position without understanding and assessing those proofs. And so what's required here is when talking about the personality of the student, or the person studying theology, yes, they have to, have a philosophical mindset. And what that also requires, the other type of mindset they need to bring is that of a critical mindset, what's called al-aqliyatun naqd, right? Which is bringing to their studies an approach where, especially where they are assessing arguments, right? And they're not just taking arguments at face value, and so rather they're asking important questions about the nature of the evidence, about the nature of the argument that's being made. And so this, what we can call this like aqliyatun naqd, right? And so, in other words, do we accept an opinion or an evidence just because a person says so? No, we're looking at their evidence. Of course, we're looking at the masters of theology, and these are master scholars. But and they've given us their proofs and evidences, right? But many times, for example, in one book, they may give arguments for a particular position, and in another book, they may give different set of arguments, right? So that ability then to see, well, why did they give these arguments? What was weak in this argument? Was there something weak in the way they argued this position before, or was there something not? There are many issues that one encounters. Take, for example, the issue of ru'ya, right? The beatific vision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here, like, is there there's a big debate amongst scholars of Ahl Sunnah as to what's the best argument for the beatific vision, the ru'ya. Is it based solely on transmitted knowledge, or is there a rational basis? Can one provide a purely rational argument that the ru'ya is something that's possible? And so here Imam Maturidi has a particular position. Later Maturidi scholars differ from him. The Ash'ari scholars have a particular position on which is a stronger argument. And so how do you assess what's a strong argument? Well, you have to have this critical mind, right? And so this aqliyatul naql is incredibly important. And it's not just something in the science of kalam, by the way. It's something that even in fiqh, right, one has to develop this way. Because when you give arguments for fiqh, and arguments in usul, and even in grammar, even in balagha, all the Islamic sciences require this aqliyatul naql, right, this critical mind and approaching the sciences in this way. And so some scholars actually say one of the most beautiful works and beautiful scholars in our ummah, I believe, is Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, for example, and a very good work, which is how that embodies this type of critical mindset. Of course, there are books in Kalam that do this very beautifully, and it's pretty much the standard. But even outside of al-Kalam, this is a Sharh an Umdatul Ahkam, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. When you read this book, you will learn, you will see manifested right in front of you a very, very uh, critical approach to how rulings are derived from hadith, and he does it in a very beautiful manner, very deep, methodological, principled manner, and it embodies adab as well, like full respect for other opinions, and even if he disagrees with them. So this is an important thing. What some scholars say is like a nuz'atun naqdiyya, right? Having this type of critical mindset. This is different than what we call critical thinking or being critical, like in Western, academic context, right? And so that's important to keep in mind here. The problem with this mindset, though, we have to keep this in mind, mention this. The problem sometimes when it comes to being critical is people can either be superficially critical, right, or overly critical, where it's not, justified, or it's not reasonable, and or do it in a superficial manner. And then you have the opposite, which is people who are qualified are and who have extensive knowledge. They themselves are not critical, and are not undertaking a critical approach to what they know. So here, when we're talking about developing this critical mindset, it has to be for someone who is qualified to do so, right? And that's important. So if you talk about the early stages that Dr. Hamza was talking about, at that stage, the critical mindset is not, it could be there, but it's not really expected because you're building foundations, right? So at that stage, the critical mindset perhaps is, not required, but you should be, the teacher should be someone who's able to carry out a critical reading of the text, and so they should be qualified to do so. But the student is not expected to do so. Rather, they're on the path to do so. But as the student, progresses through the stages that Sheikh Hamza talked about, at the level of tahqiq and the level of tahrir mahall al-niza, here you have to be critical, right? And you have to have this critical. You have to be able to assess arguments, right? And so that's why this naqd, they'll say inna naqd la yajuz illa lil muta'ahhil lahu, right? That critically assessing arguments is only should only be done by someone who has a proper qualifications to do so, right? And even though the person is qualified to do so, they should be very cautious and they should be very judicious in carrying out a critical reading and critical assessment of arguments, and they have to be very nuanced in this. And so now, unfortunately, we have many people who say, okay, I need to be critical. And so they'll come to class and they haven't really studied the science, or they're a novice, they're in the beginning stages. They don't have much, they know a few things, but they don't, and they think based off of that alone, I'm able to start critiquing and assessing arguments. And it becomes a very superficial exercise, right? And uh, and so that's something that one have to be careful of. or somebody who just has like who may be like a dilettante, right? And they just know maybe about a particular science, and they haven't really studied it, and then they start critiquing the major authorities of the science, right? So someone who hasn't studied Kalam or Usul, they'll start criticizing Ghazali, right? And they haven't really, an argument that al-Ghazali made, and they haven't really, they don't have the qualifications. They haven't even studied what Imam Ghazali has studied, right? Or they'll start criticizing Juwaini, or they'll start criticizing, some of these major authorities. And so that's a that's not what a critical mindset entails. Being critical, should only be done by someone who's has the qualifications to do so. And so that's important. But then on the other flip side, we have people who are very, very learned individuals, and all they do, they'll just teach the text, and they'll teach the text as it is, and any questions the student has, any type of assessment of the arguments given in the text, they don't really engage in those, right? So, we have both of these phenomena exist in our times. And what we have to do is make sure that we do need a critical attitude, we do need a critical mindset, but it has to be done with the proper qualifications, and the student has to be at the proper level to carry out this critical analysis. Yeah.
Dr. Omar, and to take off from one of the points that you mentioned, which was many really good points about what it really means to be critical, what it means to have a critical mindset. It's not just one thing, but it relates to different aspects of both, of studying and learning, analyzing, and comparing. I wanted to ask Dr. Hamza if we are supposed to approach ilm al-kalam in a critical way. At the same time, we want to have confidence in the science, thiqa, with this knowledge, that this is knowledge that is worth our time and effort. How do we balance between this when we are sifting between what does it mean to be critical at the same time to have confidence in the subject?
نعم، يعني هذه الكلمة، كلمة الثقة، كلمة مهمة جدا ومعبرة جدا عن المطلوب لإتقان هذا العلم. يعني كما ذكر الأستاذ عمر، هذا العلم لا يقوم على التقليد، فيه تحقيق، والتحقيق يحتاج إلى نقد كما شرح لكم، يحتاج إلى نقد ومتابعة الأقوال والبحث عن أخطائها وكشفها وتصحيحها وما شابه ذلك. هذا النقد من داخل العلم، يعني النقد في مسائل العلم، في أقوال العلماء فيه، في الاستدلالات، في الأسئلة، في الأجوبة. لكن الثقة بالعلم هي الثقة بجوهر العلم، الثقة بنظرية العلم، الثقة بماهية العلم، الثقة بالأبستمولوجي التي يعني يقوم عليها العلم، نظرية المعرفة. فهذا يعطي طالب العلم توازن ما بين أنه يثق بهذا العلم، ولكنه في نفس الوقت قادر إذا تأهل، طبعا كما ذكر الأستاذ، إذا تأهل قادر على نقد الجزئيات فيه، قادر على نقد بعض الأقوال فيه، قادر على نقد بعض المسائل فيه. فيتوازن، لأن كثرة النقد قد تؤدي إلى نقد العلم في جوهره، وهذا ما حصل عند بعض المعاصرين من المفكرين قبل 100 سنة تقريبا، أو بنهاية القرن ال19 بداية القرن ال20، أنهم نقدوا علم الكلام في أصل وجوده، في جوهره، في نظريته، وأرادوا استبداله بعلم الكلام الجديد، ما سموه بعلم الكلام الجديد. فهذا يعني كثرة النقد أفضت إلى النقد من الخارج أيضا، والنقد في الجوهر، والنقد في النظرية الفكرية. لكن أيضا كثرة التسليم وعدم النقد والثقة الزائدة، إذا تجاوزت الثقة بالماهية والثقة بالجوهر، صارت الثقة بالمسائل والأقوال وكذا، أدت إلى جمود العلم وتعطله عن التطور. فلا بد من الموازنة من خلال الثقة بالعلم مع نقد مسائله ونقد الأقوال التفصيلية فيه.
And so what it means to be confident in the science is to be wary of either extreme. We spoke earlier that in ilm al-kalam specifically, to achieve mastery, a level of tahqiq requires an ability to craft an argument. And crafting an argument means that you're in conversation with other people who are often arguing against your position. And so within the science, there is a great amount of critical work. But when it comes to the science, when we think of the science as a whole, or its epistemology, what it relies on as its overall structure, that confidence is something different. So what we were being critical with was internal to the science. Then there's the actual framework of the science, which is something that we should have a confidence in. But it can, but when we go to either extreme, as happened in just the previous century, that there were those that became, say, so critical that they even began to doubt the science itself and try to craft a new field called Kalam al-Jadid. At the same time, if we're overconfident in the science, then it can lead to an ossification, to a fossilization, to a jumud in the science that doesn't allow us to move forward. So it's about this balance, and keep in mind the difference between internal critique versus external confidence.
نتابع نقطة لو سمحت.
بسم الله.
أيضا قديما قالوا العلم لا يعطيك بعضه إلا إذا أعطيته كلك، فإذا أعطيته بعضك لم يعطك شيئا. وهذه عبارة مشهورة في آداب طالب العلم. فعلى قياسها يمكن أن نقول اليوم العلم لا يعطيك بعضه إلا إذا وثقت به. لكن من دخل هذا العلم بشخصية يعني مزلزلة، بشخصية ضعيفة، إنه سأجرب لعله أستفيد منه أو ربما لا أستفيد، لأنه علم الكلام خصوصا في آخر يعني 100 سنة تعرض لهجمات كما قلنا، يعني هجمات في جدواه، في حقيقة يعني ثمرته. فبعض الناس صار يدخله بنظرية من يريد أن يجرب لعله يعطيني لعله لا يعطيني. من يدخل بهذه النظرة سيفشل حتما. العلم لن يعطيك بعضه إلا إذا وثقت به. لكن من دخل علم الكلام بثقة واستطاع أن يحل مشاكل كبيرة جدا في الفلسفة المعاصرة، وسأضرب مثال على هذا لكن أسمع يعني نسمع الترجمة.
We commonly hear the expression as among students of knowledge, we hear this, that a knowledge will not give you some of it until you give all of it. So if you give just some of yourself, you're not going to get it. But if you give all of yourself, we may get a portion. And so along a similar line of thinking, Dr. Hamza says that a knowledge will not give you some of it unless you are confident in it. So in the past century, there were those that thought just to experiment, to just see what might come of it if we study it. And so that right there is not going to allow us to gain, again, that mastery, and for us to be able to gain that knowledge fully. Until we are confident in it, it will not give us all of it. Just as if we do not give all of ourselves to it, it will not give us some of it.
نعم، مثال من الواقع حتى لا يكون الكلام يعني افتراضيا أو خياليا، أو يقول أحد أنتم يعني تفترضون أنني إذا وثقت سأنجح. لا، هناك أمثلة من الواقع، وأوضح وأشهر مثال على ذلك هو شيخ الإسلام مصطفى صبري رحمه الله تعالى، الذي توفي في خمسينيات القرن الماضي، القرن العشرين. الشيخ مصطفى صبري هو خريج المدارس العثمانية الكلاسيكية التقليدية، ودرس علم الكلام على الطريقة التراثية تماما. واستطاع مصطفى صبري أن في كتابه موقف العقل والعلم والعالم من رب العالمين، في هذا الكتاب في 4 مجلدات، استطاع مصطفى صبري أن يشتبك مع عشرات المسائل الفكرية المعاصرة. استطاع أن يشتبك مع فلاسفة الغرب، يعني بدءا من ديكارت، كانت، ديفيد هيوم، جون لوك، كذا، يعني اشتبك مع عدد كبير من فلاسفة الغرب، واستطاع أن يدرك أقوالهم إلى درجة كبيرة جدا من الصحة. وهذا ليس كلامي، هذا كلام باحث، يعني درس نقد مصطفى صبري لكانت، ووجد أن فهم مصطفى صبري للفيلسوف كانت إلى درجة كبيرة جدا من الدقة والصحة، مع أنه لم يقرأ فلسفة كانت بلغته، وإنما قرأها مترجمة، وهذا مظنة الخطأ. ومع ذلك لأنه هو داخل علم الكلام بثقة عالية جدا، ومتقن لعلم الكلام بالمستويات التي قلناها من الاقتصار والاقتصاد والاستقصاء. نعم، واشتبك مع الأفكار الحداثية المعاصرة أيضا، يعني كان مشتبك مع كل أفكار مصر في ذلك الزمن، هو كان يعيش في مصر، واستطاع أن يناقش كبار المثقفين في مصر في جميع أفكارهم. طبعا هذا لا يعني كما ذكر الأستاذ يعني مسألة النقد، هذا لا يعني أن كل ما قاله يمكن أن يسلم له، قد نناقش في بعض التفاصيل، ولكن يعني هذا مثال العالم الذي وثق بالعلم فاستطاع أن ينتج نتاجا فكريا قويا جدا وثابتا وقادر على المواجهة في الحقيقة.
And so what we've just described is not just a matter of having a positive attitude. It's not just a purely hypothetical scenario. That if we take the example of Sheikh Mustafa Sabri, who passed away in the 1950s, who studied and learned ilm al-kalam in a way that we would describe as traditional, and we look at his engagement in his book Mawqif al-Aql, this multi-volume work in which he is confidently engaging with a range of philosophical ideas from Kant to Hume to Descartes, and he's doing so again with ilm al-kalam as his main tool. According to a research, somebody who looked very closely at Sheikh Mustafa Sabri's works, it's evident that Sheikh Mustafa Sabri rahimahullah understood Kant very well, even though he wasn't reading it he wasn't reading it in the original German, and so he was reading it in translation. But it shows that confidence shows in terms of the work that was produced at the end of the day. And so I think that the path is or at least the end of the path is clear to us. But one of the questions that's most on every student's mind as we're embarking on a course of study is to understand what is the map, what is the kharita, we're going into uncharted territory often with different kinds of curriculums that are out there. What can you help us, Dr. Hamza, understand the terrain out there? What are the steps that a student should go through to map, to proceed very carefully with ilm al-kalam? What books should they read perhaps alongside themselves, alongside their main books, and how to proceed here through this very difficult path?
نعم، يعني دخول طالب العلم إلى الفن مع وجود صورة كلية للفن في ذهنه التي يعني نسميها خريطة الفن، أو سماها علماؤنا قديما المبادئ لهذا الفن، المبادئ 10، بعضهم ينقصها قليلا بعضهم يزيدها. المهم مبادئ الفن التي تعطيك التصور الكلي للدخول في هذا الفن، هذا من أهم ما يعين ويساعد على الإتقان. طبعا المبادئ تشمل التعريف، تشمل موضوع الفن، تشمل ثمرته، تشمل واضعه، تشمل النسبة بينه وبين العلوم الأخرى، مسائل هذا الفن إلى آخره. لكن هذه المبادئ يعني الحصول عليها أو الوقوف عليها يساعد على تصور هذا الفن، فيساعد على كيفية الاستمرار فيه، كيفية بناء شخصية علمية والوصول إلى أعلى المراتب فيه. تترجم؟
This terminology of the map or the kharita of ilm or the mabadi', the fundamentals, is something that is present amongst all of the sciences, and in the case of ilm al-kalam, it is one that a student must be able to understand and see the science as a whole first. And so before going into that kind of territory, that's what you first have to have in front of you.
نعم، أنا أريد أن أقف مع مبدأين من هذه المبادئ فقط لأربطهما بموضوع الإتقان، إتقان العلم. يعني واحد من هذين المبدأين، أحد هذين المبدأين هو الموضوع، والمبدأ الآخر هو الغاية، وهما من يعني أهم مبدأين في المبادئ 10 في الحقيقة، موضوع الفن وغاية الفن. والعلماء قالوا من دخل الفن وهو متصور هذه المبادئ يعني دخل فيه على بصيرة، ومن دخل الفن دون أن يتصور هذه المبادئ قال تخبط خبط عشواء. هذه عبارة علمائنا قديما، وهذا ما نراه في الساحة المعاصرة لمن يدخل الفنون دون أن يدرك مبادئها، في الحقيقة يتخبطون خبط عشواء كما قالوا. فقضية الموضوع، موضوع علم الكلام كما ذكرنا يعني هو يبحث في ذات الله تعالى وصفاته، في ذات الأنبياء وصفاتهم، ماذا يجب لهم، ماذا يجوز، ماذا يستحيل في حق الله وفي حق الأنبياء كما قال بعض العلماء، أو بعضهم قال هو يبحث في الموجود مطلقا لكن من جهة إثبات العقائد الدينية. وكما ذكر الأستاذ عمر، ذكر تعريف الإيجي في علم الكلام، قال علم يقتدر معه على إثبات العقائد الدينية، على إثبات العقائد الدينية، فالموضوع يتصل بإثبات العقائد الدينية، وهذا يدخلنا إلى الغاية. الغاية هي إثبات العقائد الدينية، إثبات العقائد بإقامة الحجج ودفع الشبه، يعني إقامة الأدلة على هذه العقائد لتحصينها من أي شبهة قد تأتي في المستقبل، ليس شرط أن تكون الشبهة الآن موجودة، ودفع الشبه الحاضرة والموجودة.
And so amongst these fundamental principles, perhaps the most important is the actual subject and the goal of the science. And so in the case of ilm al-kalam, it's being our beliefs, and then the goal of being able to establish them, being able to defend them. And the ulama say that whoever has and enters a science keeping in mind these principles over the goal of what, or the definition that was earlier discussed, that they are entering into a field aware of what's going on. And whoever doesn't, they've taken a chaotic step, and chaos will be there, will be that consequence.
فبعض الناس يدخل إلى علم الكلام وهو يظن أن الغاية منه هي الدعوة إلى الله تبارك وتعالى، مخاطبة الغربيين مثلا أو غير المسلمين وتبليغهم الدين عن طريق علم الكلام. يظن هذه غاية علم الكلام، يظن أنني إذا درست هذا العلم أستطيع أن يعني أذهب وأبلغ الناس الدين وأدعوهم إلى الإسلام وما شابه ذلك. بعض الناس يظن أن يعني غاية هذا العلم هي مخاطبة الشباب ويعني تثبيتهم في الدين وترسيخ الإيمان في قلوبهم، مع أن هؤلاء الشباب قسم منهم ليس عنده شبهات عقلية في الدين، لكن هو يعني واقع في الشهوات، واقع في يعني ملاهي الدنيا ومتاعها وهكذا. فيظن بعض الناس أنه عن طريق علم الكلام سنرسخ الإيمان في قلوبهم ونثبتهم على طريق الطاعة والتقوى، مع أنه لا هذا ولا هذا هو غاية علم الكلام، لا تبليغ الدين للناس ولا دعوة غير المسلمين إلى الإسلام ولا ترسيخ الإيمان في قلوب الناس، في قلوب الشباب مثلا. لكن من كان من الشباب صاحب شبهة، نعم هنا وظيفة علم الكلام أن يحله شبهته. من كان من الشباب يعني يقرأ للفلسفات الأخرى والأفكار الأخرى والأديان الأخرى ويتعرض إلى هجمات واعتراضات، من الضروري أن نخاطبه بعلم الكلام. عندما أنا أبلغ الدعوة لغير المسلمين لا أبلغها بعلم الكلام، لكن لو كان فئة من المبلغين عنده ثقافة فلسفية أو ثقافة دينية مع أديان أخرى، فيقول لماذا تقولون بكذا ولا تقولون بكذا، وما صحة قولكم بكذا، هنا أحتاج إلى علم الكلام. فنحتاجها إلى صنف من الشباب، ونحتاج علم الكلام في يعني صنف من المخاطبين بالدعوة إلى الله تبارك وتعالى. فبعض الناس عندما يدخل علم الكلام بهذا الخطأ في تصور الغاية وتصور الموضوع، بعد ذلك يجد أنه يفشل عندما يقول أنا خاطبت الناس وما اقتنعوا، خاطبت الناس فوجدنا أنه الأمر قالوا هذا الدين معقد ولا يفهم وأنت أدخلتنا في فلسفات قديمة كذا. خاطبت الشباب فزدتهم شبهات، لأنه هو كان خالي الذهن من الشبهة فأنا أعطيته الشبهة. فهذا التخبط الذي ذكرناه تخبط خبط عشواء، لأنه لم يتصور مبادئ هذا الفن فما أتقنه، فكان حاجزا، هذا التخبط حاجز بينه وبين إتقان الفن.
And so two misconceptions often people come to ilm al-kalam with is that, number one, why am I studying ilm al-kalam? I'm studying it because I want to be able to convey the religion of Islam to those who are not yet Muslim, or I'm studying ilm al-kalam so that way I can address the youth of our time and to be able to help them. And he said Dr. Hamza said we have to look at both these groups more carefully. This goal, we have to refine the goal, because the first group, it may not be that we need to come forward with ilm al-kalam itself. We are explaining what the deen of Islam is, and if there happens to be an issue that comes up, then of a particular class of people, maybe then we have to turn to ilm al-kalam for just that specific issue, but not necessarily general, to use it as a general tool. Similarly with youth, the issues that youth may be encountering are not necessarily deep theological issues always. It could be that it's just that they're stuck in desire, it's identity issues. There's a whole other host of issues. And sometimes by bringing ilm al-kalam forward in this scenario and the other scenario, we might only increase the doubts that are out there. Somebody may be coming across a question that they probably didn't even think about before. So we have to think very carefully about how we're approaching the science. Um, Dr. Omar, as we approach the science, it seems we know that none of the sciences in the Sharia operate independently, and part of the Mabadi al-Ashra is the connection between the science and other sciences. And so, could you help us understand the broader ecosystem, both within the Sharia and beyond the Islamic sciences, from philosophy, natural sciences, and what it means to be able to find that balance and to approach each of those subjects properly and marshal them for the sake of ilm al-kalam?
No, Bismillah. So, as we mentioned before, that when ulama have divided or classified the Islamic sciences or all sciences, ilm al-kalam was one of those sciences that they discussed. And as Imam al-Ghazali, he classifies, when he's classifying ilm al-kalam, as he said in Sunan al-Mustasfa, he called it al-ilm al-kulli. It's a universal science. And for the reasons that we mentioned prior, which is that it establishes the foundations, right, of all the other Islamic sciences. And so, meaning that what the other Islamic sciences assume, um, those assumptions, and every science has assumptions, those are established in the universal science of Ilm al-Kalam theology. So that's very important to appreciate that for students, right? That even if someone is studying hadith, that there is what's the relationship of hadith towards ilm al-kalam? And so that needs to be appreciated even when you're studying the usul al-fiqh, or you're studying tafsir, or all of that needs to be appreciated just in terms of the relationship of one science to another. Having said that, they are explicit, even when you're studying usul al-fiqh, they are issues that are kalam issues that come up in usul al-fiqh, such as, what does the whole discussion on good and evil, and tahsin wa taqbih, and whether they are discernible by human reason or not. That's an issue in usul al-fiqh, but it's actually a kalam issue, but it's an incredibly important issue. As Sadr al-Sharia, for example, mentions one of the most foundational issues in usul al-fiqh, but yet it's a kalam issue. So you might find, as a student of Islamic sciences, why do you have to study all the Islamic sciences as much as you can? Because you will find kalam issues discussed in places that one might not anticipate or expect, right? And so that's important to keep in mind. And also because kalam it relates to so many other sciences, one has to study those sciences to see how discussions and how topics are treated, right, and their impact in other sciences. And so that's an important thing. The other thing is, even practically, if you look at individuals are like the great authorities of kalam, take people like Imam Taftazani, Al-Iji, Fakhruddin Razi, Ghazali. I mean, they were authorities in so many other sciences. So Imam Taftazani wasn't only a mutakallim. I mean, he was a logician, right? He was a rhetorician as well. He wrote so many works in Balagha, and there's discussions on language and signification and meaning and the relationship between words and language and meaning, um, that are critical in discussions of al-kalam as well, right? And so, and vice versa. Usul al-fiqh, I mean, Imam Taftazani wrote some of the greatest commentaries at Talwiyah, on, as an example. And there's incredible, as we mentioned, discussions and critical theological discussions in one encounters in books of usul as well. So these imams themselves, so this idea that happens that, oh, okay, let me just focus on one science, and that's kalam, and I'm not going to really pay attention, or to other sciences. This is not a path to mastery. This is not a path to mastery. If we bring it back to our discussion on mastery, mastery will entail everything that we mentioned, but also learning the other Islamic sciences. And this happens too. They are, Muslims, alhamdulillah, who are, there's a revival of theological discussions in the Western Academy by Muslims as well. And that's the thing, is that they tend to fragment and compartmentalize their theological studies. So they're very interested in Kalam, but when it comes to all the other Islamic sciences, they're not aware, and they don't have that degree of mastery in other Islamic sciences, and that weakens their appreciation and weakens their theological understandings too. So definitely, studying these sciences is critical, right? Other Islamic sciences, because this helps in the mastery of Ilm al-Kalam. And like I said, Imam Fakhruddin Razi, he has works in Kalam, but then he has incredible works in Usul al-Fiqh as well. And so, that has to be, kept in mind. Ghazali, similar, right? He was a master Usuli, and he was a master in Kalam, but he was a master in logic. He was a master in fiqh. He was a mujtahid in the Shafi'i madhab as well. And then tasawwuf, he was a master as well. So you see, all of these will really help in understanding, and mastering al kalam, because you get this, you see how it penetrates, and all the other Islamic sciences, and how the conclusions of ilm al-kalam, and their entailments are, and the fruits of those conclusions are seen and brought about in other Islamic sciences, especially like tafsir and hadith commentary, because tafsir, the Quran, as we know, it like, one has to know all the sciences to understand the Quran. It's a jami', right? It brings all these Islamic sciences together, and one cannot do tafsir without that. And so, when you look in the books of tafsir, you see incredible kalam discussions there as well, amongst others. And then same in hadith commentary. So one cannot, when mastering ilm al-kalam, one cannot restrict themselves to these mutun of ilm al-kalam. One has to go and read books of tafsir and hadith, and for that requires other sciences. In particular, I would probably like to just highlight two sciences that are critical and need more attention when studying Ilm al-Kalam as well. And that is the science of mantiq and logic, and the science of Adab al-Bahth wal-Munadara, which is the science of dialectics and disputation. Now, this is important because what this does is that, especially the science of Adab al-Bahth wal-Munadara, the science of Munadara, this is kind of what I consider to be our religious pedagogy in many ways, right? In the sense that this is the methodology of how truth is arrived at, and how truth is reasoned discursively towards. You have to have a methodology, and our methodology is, you can find it very nicely in the science of Adab al-Bahth al-Munadara, and it talks about a methodology to approach one, investigating issues, and when clarifying issues. So all the levels that Dr. Hamza mentioned, all the levels of mastery, one of the tools for that is the science of Adab al-Bahth al-Munadara. So it's critical that we obtain that science. Now, in order to obtain that science, one should have already studied logic, right? And so, because disputation assumes much of what's in logic. And so, so those two sciences need to be paid attention to when studying, and when attempting to, obtain the mastery of Ilm al-Kalam as well. And then those provide the rules and methodology for inquiring, and for conducting tahqiq, for having this, critical mindset, this aqliyatun naqd. The method for that, it's just not, you just start asking questions arbitrarily. No, you have to ask questions and conduct your inquiry based on the rules of adab al-bahth and munadara. So that's a critical science, and it's important to bring our attention to. It's not studied enough, I think, and in the institutes that teach the Islamic sciences, this is critical. And you'll see this. This is the same methodology one employs in fiqh, right? And advanced fiqh, and it's the same methodology one employs in all the other Islamic sciences as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar. I think that's it's a really important set of reminders with regard to the position of ilm al-kalam as we move through our studies. And now let's return to ilm al-kalam and the science itself. Often as the students learning Arabic, they realize that mustalahat and terminology can make it seem as if they're learning multiple Arabics, right, over time. Seeing how the terminology changes. Dr. Hamza, what advice do you have for approaching the terminology of ilm al-kalam and maybe terminology in general of sciences? How does one get a grip of these ma'ani through these alfaz?
نعم، موضوع المصطلحات موضوع شائك ومعقد جدا في الحقيقة. وإشكالية المصطلحات ليست إشكالية في علم الكلام فقط، بل في جميع العلوم هذه الإشكالية واقعة، بل في جميع الحياة، جميع جوانب الحياة. نحن اليوم في الحياة الاجتماعية أو السياسية أو الاقتصادية نعاني من مشكلة الاصطلاحات، لأنه قد يتكلم فلان بكلمة بمصطلح لكن هو يتصورها بتصور، نحن نتصورها بتصور آخر لأنه عندنا المصطلح بمعنى آخر. فقد ينبني على هذا اتفاق حيث لا اتفاق أصلا، وقد ينبني على ذاك اختلاف حيث لا اختلاف أصلا، وإنما الإشكالية المصطلح. الإشكالية في العلوم أن المصطلحات تتطور مع الأجيال. يعني المصطلح في زمن المتقدمين ليس نفس دلالة المصطلح في زمن المتأخرين. كذلك قد يتغير دلالة المصطلح ما بين مذهب ومذهب، ما بين مثلا أهل السنة والمعتزلة، ما بين الفلاسفة والمتكلمين، حتى ما بين مذاهب أهل السنة الداخلية التفصيلية قد يتغير دلالة المصطلح ما بين الأشاعرة والماتريدية أحيانا. كذلك في الجغرافيا، يعني قد يكون دلالة المصطلح عند مدرسة المشارقة مثلا غير دلالة المصطلح عند مدرسة المغاربة. فهذا كله يعني من المعوقات والموانع التي تحول أمام الدارس للإتقان. يعني هذه حواجب تحجبني عن الإتقان لأنه تصعب علي البحث، فأنا ربما أفهم المصطلح بمعنى آخر فلا أتقن هذا الفن بسبب ذلك.
And the issue of terminology is one that affects all the sciences, really, even just in our daily lives. As words change meaning, as words mean different things sometimes to different people, we can very often have different conceptions of what we're talking about, let alone the development that happens naturally over time. That the words are not totally static in the sciences, and so what happens is even between the madhahib of Ahl Sunnah, just within our own internal discussions, the terminology may be different between them, and we have to keep our eye very closely attuned to the meanings of these.
نعم، يعني لعلي أضرب مثالا من اختلاف المصطلح بين المذاهب أو بين العلوم أولا، ثم مثال آخر من اختلاف المصطلح بين المذاهب. مثلا من المصطلحات التي نستعملها كثيرا في علم الكلام ونراه في علوم أخرى هو مصطلح التعليل، يعني طلب العلة أو البحث عن العلة، خصوصا في أفعال الله تبارك وتعالى. كما ندرس دائما على مذهب الأشاعرة على سبيل المثال، نقول إن أفعال الله تبارك وتعالى لا تعلل، يعني لا يبحث عن علتها ولا يطلب لفعله تعالى علة، لا يسأل عما يفعل سبحانه وتعالى وهم يسألون. فالطالب يدرس ويفهم هذه المسألة في علم الكلام، وأن أفعال الله لا تعلل، لا يبحث لها عن علة. ثم يتفاجأ عندما يذهب إلى أصول الفقه على سبيل المثال بأن كل باب القياس مبني على تعليل الأحكام، وأن حكم الله تعالى معلل بعلة، وحيث وجدنا هذه العلة أجرينا الحكم في فروع أخرى قسناها على الحكم الأصلي أو على المسألة الأصلية، ونقلنا الحكم من الفرع الأول إلى الفرع الثاني، وسمينا هذا أصلا وذاك فرعا، والجامع بينهما والعلة. فكل باب القياس وقائم على العلة، وباب القياس هو الذي ميز مذاهب أهل السنة الأربعة عن الظاهرية. يعني هو ليس مسألة ثانوية بالنسبة لنا، هو خصيصة ركيزة أساسية من ركائز الفقه المذهبي في المذاهب الأربعة، وهو المميز عن مذهب الظاهرية. ثم في علم النحو أيضا عندنا التعليل ولام التعليل، وفي الأفعال تأتي لام التعليل، وهكذا أيضا هذا يأتي في علم النحو كذلك. فيختلط على الطالب أنه كيف أنا الذي درست في علم الكلام يتعارض مع أصول الفقه، يتعارض مع علم النحو، فيبدأ يتخبط، وقد يفضي ذلك إلى عدم إتقان العلوم الثلاثة. يعني لا هو أتقن النحو ولا أصول الفقه ولا الكلام، أو أتقن واحدا ويعني أفسد واحدا آخر. يعني قد يقول أنا متمسك بما قرأته في الكلام فينكر القياس على سبيل المثال، أو يقول مثل ما ذكروه في القياس فاسد وما شابه ذلك.
An example of this occurring between the sciences is a word like ta'lil, a term like ta'lil. A person might study in ilm al-kalam that the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, la tu'alla, that there's no illa given to them, and then they move to fiqh, and suddenly in fiqh, as they're seeing that the illa is finding the illa behind all of the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He's given to us, that we're seeking an illah in those, and we're saying that there is an illah for them, and we're using that illah for qiyas, which is really the distinctive legal feature of our system and our ability to legislate. And then we also see the word ta'lil in nahu as well, used right with regard to the particles like lam. And so a student might approach ilm al-kalam, read and learn about this, and then want to reject it in fiqh because they're seeing that the word, that there seem to be an apparent contradiction. And so a person can get lost between these sciences as they're not keeping track of what the words mean in respective fields.
نعم. ولحل هذه المشكلة نرجع إلى قضية الملكة التي كما يعني تم الكلام سابقا هي مدار الإتقان على الملكة. فنرجع إلى الملكة. لماذا منع العلماء التعليل في أفعال الله تبارك وتعالى؟ يعني ما هو المعنى وراء ذلك؟ حتى لا نتمسك بالألفاظ، نريد البحث عن المعاني. الملكة، ما هو الفكرة التي في أذهان أهل العلم عندما منعوا التعليل في أفعال الله تبارك وتعالى؟ هل منعوا التعليل بمعنى الربط، أن يرتبط فعل الله تبارك وتعالى بنتيجة؟ فمن تصوره هكذا هو تمسك بظاهر الكلام، إنه أفعال الله لا تعلل، يعني لا يمكن أن نربطها بأي نتيجة، بأي غاية لها، بأي أمر يعقبها ويترتب عليها. فهذا سيتعارض مع النحو ويتعارض مع أصول الفقه. لكن من فهم أن أفعال الله لا تعلل، يعني السبب في هذا الحكم هو أن يكون لله تعالى الإرادة المطلقة، أن لا يحجر على الله تعالى في أفعاله، لأنه مالك الملك، هو المتصرف في الوجود، فلا يمنع من فعل ما. فليس لله تعالى باعث على الفعل، يعني ليس هناك فكرة تقتضي من الله أن يفعل، يعني هي فكرة سابقة على الفعل تقتضي من الله أن يفعل، يعني كأنها تضيق إرادة الله وتقول لابد أن يفعل كذا وكذا، فهي أمر قبل الفعل باعث على الفعل، كما يعني نبهوا على ذلك. هذا المعنى الذي نمنعه، لكن هذا المعنى لا نراه في أصول الفقه في الحقيقة، لأن العلة التي في الأصول هي ليست باعثة على التحليل والتحريم، بل الله تبارك وتعالى مثلا حرم كذا وهو ربط التحريم بمعنى من المعاني، ليس هذا المعنى جعل الله يحرم، بل الله حرم بإرادته المطلقة وربط هذا التحريم بمعنى، وقال لنا كلما ترون هذا المعنى أجروا التحريم كما أجريته في الفرع الأول، فلا تعارض بينهما أصلا. فالملكة، رجعنا إلى الملكة من جديد، هي التي تحل هذه الإشكالية.
So when we return back to the framework of Malaka that we spoke about earlier, Dr. Hamza mentioned that it's all about following the meanings and not the words. So let's apply it to this example here. When we consider why did the ulama, why did they not want to say that the actions of Allah have a reason, if we're going to translate it that way? that it's not to say that an action of Allah cannot be connected to some outward apparent consequence. The real issue is that they want to preserve the absolute will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there is no motivation or some external force that is forcing Allah to do a certain act. So now when we return to fiqh, we don't see this here. In fiqh, it's not that Allah legislated this because it needed, there was something haram that was needed in the world, and that's why Allah. That connection between it being halal or haram is something that came separate, that is a connection to it. But it's not a motivation, something that required Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do something.
والمصطلح الثاني باختصار حتى لا نطيل مصطلح الوجوب مثلا، هذا بين المذاهب الآن، ليس بين العلوم، بين المذاهب. مصطلح الوجوب، فعندما يقول مثلا الفلاسفة عن أمر من الأمور أنه واجب، يعني عندما يقول المعتزلة أنه واجب، عندما يقول الماتريدية مثلا أنه واجب، عندما يقول الأشاعرة أنه واجب، هل يقصدون الواجب لذاته أو الواجب لغيره؟ واجب عقلا طبعا. هل يقولون واجب لذاته أو الواجب لغيره؟ وبينهما فرق. فإذا كان مثلا المذهب الأول يقول أنه واجب ولكن يقصد لغيره، فهذا لا يعارض أن المذهب الآخر يقول أنه ممكن، يعني ممكن لذاته ولكنه وجب لأمر من الخارج، لأمر لغيره. لكن لو قال واجب لذاته وممكن لذاته صار بينهما تعارض. كذلك هل هو واجب على الله تعالى أو واجب من الله تعالى؟ المعتزلة عندما يوجبون بعض الأفعال كالصلاح والأصلح ونحوها يوجبونها على الله، يعني منشأ الوجوب من حقيقة الفعل وجب على الله أن يفعل، وهذا إشكال عند أهل السنة. لكن الماتريدية عندما يوجبون بعض أفعال الله تبارك وتعالى يوجبونها من الله، يعني منشأ الوجوب من حكمة الله تبارك وتعالى، وليس من حقيقة هذه الأفعال أنها أوجبت على الله. فقد تتشابه العبارة، وأن المعتزلة يقولون واجب عقلا والماتريدية يقولون واجب عقلا، لكن هؤلاء يقصدون واجب على الله وهؤلاء يقصدون واجب من الله. فالمصطلح مهم جدا في إتقان العلم، يعني تحديد المصطلح والتدقيق في معناه وضبطه ثم بناء المسألة عليه، هذا مهم جدا في إتقان الفن.
So similarly, a word like wujub, right, within ilm al-kalam itself, a word like wujub, a term like wujub, has a qualifying aspect to it, which is that is something wujub in of in itself, or is it secondarily necessary for it to occur? So for example, something could be secondarily necessary because of some other external force, but in itself it's mumkin, right? It's merely possible. And so we have to look at these qualifiers because there may be apparent contradictions between two schools because of the way that the word mumkin and wujub are used, but they can operate at the same level when we consider something like lidatihi, lighayrihi for primary or secondary purposes. Similarly, when with another qualifier that's used with when we talk about something being wajib aqlan, the Mu'tazila will use the term ala, like upon Allah, whereas for the Maturidi, perhaps they are using a word like min Allah. And so by just that change in expression there, when we think of something as what is rationally necessary, that there are two different things, because for the Maturidi, for example, it is from the hikmah, it is out of hikmah for Allah to do a certain to act, whereas for the Mu'tazila it is upon Allah. And so this is where we get these distinctions in terminology. And so I think those are definitely enough of cautionary signs that we have to proceed very carefully as we're reading the books, because it can be a very dangerous exercise when we misapply words between sciences or within a science by itself. So even with the right terminology, with the right map of the sciences, even with a student coming to ilm al-kalam with bahth and munadhara, with mantiq, there are a number of other subjects outside and let's say beyond that are necessary for a student perhaps to take part in. But in approaching those, Dr. Omar, could you share with us some advice as what should be on the radar of a student of Ilm al-Kalam, and how should they approach those other fields that are perhaps beyond what their madrasa or ma'had offers?
Bismillah. So, typically, I guess I can start with some examples, and then we can see what these examples, you know, provide for us in terms of how to approach the question that you asked. If we look, I think Dr. Hamza mentioned Sheikh Mustafa Sabri. Uh, um, it's a wonderful example how he's someone who had a full mastery of the tradition. He studied, the highest texts and the commentaries, and he had all the sciences that were required for this, for him to conduct what needed to do. And he was, and there were other people too in the Ottoman who graduated from the Ottoman system as well at this time. But him and Sheikh Mustafa Zahal al-Kawthari as well. They're the ones who came to Egypt for various political reasons, and they landed themselves in Cairo, and so they encountered a very different world there, and it's important to pay attention to that. And then we could look at other figures too, like Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi, for example, and the writings that he's written in so many sciences, but yeah, he's actually written some really interesting works in Kalam as well. And one of the things that he's done is he's had a original contribution where he developed what's called the Qawa'id al-Kalamiyya. And so many scholars have noted this development. So, like we have Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya, Ashbah al-Nadar, we have Qawa'id al-Nahu, and things like this. And you see in different sciences. And one of the things we're seeing now is principles, right? Maxims or canons in theology. And that's something Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi really helped develop. And also we have Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, who's written a book on this too, and developing what are the theological maxims. And so like we have Sheikh Mustafa Sabri's book, Mawqif al-Aql, and then we have Ashraf Ali Thanwi's work, who passed away in 1943 before him. Then we have Badiou Zaman Said Nursi, and who passed away in 1960, and his Rasail al-Nur. It's an incredible contribution of dealing with the multiple topics, and many of them theological, metaphysical, but in a way, and then we have another figure, Sheikh Ramadan al-Butia as well, rahimullah. And so what's common, I want to point these figures out because what's really interesting is that these are all what's common between all these figures are a number of things. One is, they were definitely scholars in a very consummate sense, meaning that these were, they were ulama in the proper sense of the word, and in meaning that they didn't just master one science, they mastered multiple sciences. At the same time, they were definitely figures who contributed significantly in the area of theology. But what's interesting is, although they can teach, they study, they can teach, and have written, some works on mutun and hawashi and shura. So they continue those, teaching manuals and those teaching texts. But at the same time, that's common between them all. And what's another interesting feature that's common between them, these figures, is that they've all written original works as well. They've contributed original works, and in various questions and fields that the societies they lived in, Muslims encountered, right? And this is a very important aspect. And what this means is that they were able to acquire uh, other sciences, right? And that in their times that there were conversations that were taking place, and they impacted the lives of Muslims. They impacted the scholarly tradition. They were advocating positions and voices and approaches to Islam that may not have been that would be considered to have been problematic for a Sunni or Shi'i point of view, or even a Mu'tazili point of view. And so that's important, right? So if you take someone like, Sheikh Ramadan Busti, right? I mean, yes, his life is pretty, very, very important life to, reflect on. He's definitely somebody who taught, Ashbah wa Nadha'ir, he taught Risala Qushayriya, he taught the Hikmah ibn Ata'ila. These are very important works. But then he also taught, right, works that he wrote. So he wrote a book, Kubra al-Yaqiniyat al-Kawniyya, and that was a standard textbook for contemporary students in Damascus University. Um, at the same time, he wrote, Fiqh al-Sirah, right? And then he also wrote books that dealt in the life, the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, right? But answering many different, questions, especially how do we view, who a prophet is and what is a prophet, and how there was different, and there, the conception of miracles as they relate to prophets, because there are many writers at that time who were writing biographies of the prophet, and they were downplaying miracles because they didn't, they were influenced more by, the empiricism coming from England, and so they didn't really, they're kind of embarrassed, or they're kind of, they didn't have much confidence in this idea of miracles. So when they wrote biographies of the Prophet, alayhi salam, they would downplay the importance of it, and sometimes denying, or trying to reinterpret, what these miracles that we have been transmitted mean and how they're understood. At the same time, Sheikh Buti wrote Al-Insan Musayyir or Mukhayyir, like the idea of free will and determinism, like a whole book on this, right? And he also engaged in Marxist thought, right? Because there were many in Damascus University. There were many figures who were who are definitely, who are advocating different, viewpoints and coming from different intellectual schools, right? So, for example, a major figure that he engaged was Tayyib. His name was Tayyib Tazini, right? He was a Syrian Arab philosopher. And he was a professor of philosophy at Damascus University, and he had this huge project, right, to reinterpret Arabic Islamic intellectual history, but through a Marxist and dialectical framework. And so Sheikh Buti wrote, a whole book on critiquing, dialectical materialism. And so that's, and then there's also in the Abu Ya'rub al-Marzuqi is another person who Sheikh al-Buti had a lot of debates with, and you can actually buy these, they're published, the debates on the role of usul al-fiqh and how we have to reconsider and have new foundations, new epistemological foundations for usul al-fiqh, and the whole, our whole hermeneutical approach has to be reconsidered, and what's been going on is not, sufficient anymore. So, this shows you that these are people who are masters. They have a malaka of not just Kalam, but all the other sciences. And you see that they're not just what's called a mudarris. They're not just sitting in the classroom and teaching students text. They're doing that, but they go beyond that, right? And so they're engaging different schools, different philosophical schools, different economic schools, different theological schools, and political ideology such as secularism. And Sheikh Mustafa Sabri, for example, has a whole section at the end of his book Mawqif al-Aql on what's the relationship between governance, right, and religion. And should those be separated or not, right? And this is a major issue. It's impacting the whole Muslim Ummah today, right? We're still grappling with these important questions. So what does this require? Well, obviously, this is an important question because it impacts institutionally. How should Muslims, who are institutions that are teaching the Islamic sciences, what should they look like in order to prepare and allow for students to master these sciences and Kalam in particular? What does that need to look like? Well, there's definitely a level of mastery that's required where they're studying the tradition itself and what the positions are, and they're gaining the tools of the sciences. But then there needs to be added component to it, I feel, which is there needs to be, where there is specialization, such as comparative religion, maqaranatul adyan, and not, we're not studying religions, ancient religions. We have to study ancient religions. It doesn't mean just putting up Shahrastani's work or Ibn Hazm's work or other works on comparative religion that were written by scholars in the past, but also what are contemporary religion. We have a lot of new religions, right, that are popping up. And so are we studying them, and are we preparing our students to enter this world where they're going to encounter people of these different faiths, and then how do they understand them, and are they getting them correct? And are they understanding them correctly? So comparative religion is an important thing that needs to be added. New intellectuals, traditions needs to be added into this, especially, something that I'm interested in particular is religion and science, right? So modern science, but then also, other political ideologies, such as, democracy, liberalism, secularism, the notion of freedom. So you see someone like Sheikh Buti wrote on all these topics, right? Evolution as well is very important. And so the question here is we need to, in addition to providing the training in theology itself, we need to also add on to this um, areas and programs where students can specialize, right? And so, in other words, the goal now of Islamic institutions or of Islamic science, it shouldn't be just we're just going to produce another teacher. So we're just going to produce another teacher of the Jawhara, another teacher of Shah al-Aqa'id, another teacher of Mawaqif. But no, we're going to produce someone who can actually engage, right? Other thought, intellectual thought that goes on in their societies that they find themselves in. And that's critical, right? So when we say frequently when we say someone's a great theologian, what we have in mind, unfortunately, is that they can explain the most complicated text, and but that's not like we said, that's not really the goal of ilm al-kalam. That's not really mastering it, right? And so that's important. This person could be considered a mudarris and an expert teacher, but are they mutakallim per se? Well, no, they have to be doing these other things, such as these individuals that we mentioned, Ashraf Ali Tanwi, Mustafa Sabri, Vaid Zaman Said Nursi, Sheikh al-Buti, and others. There are many others too. It's not exhaustive list of names by any means, but that's important, right? And so yes, we need to do a lot more of adding on to our curriculum, right? And these specialized programs that allow our students to better engage contemporary thought.
Conclude and inshallah anticipate the questions from the audience. I wanted to ask Dr. Hamza and Dr. Omar in just 2 or 3 minutes to answer some parting advice. And from Dr. Hamza, I'd like to ask many students, after they've studied many years, perhaps, still feel like they've put in various kinds of effort and they've read, but Ilm al-Kalam still seems like a nebulous cloud, like a cloud of different masail, that they don't see them all together. What advice would you give to that student as a parting advice?
نعم، الطالب قد يقضي زمانا طويلا في دراسة العلم ولا يصل إلى نتيجة مع أنه يبذل غاية ما يستطيع. السبب في ذلك قد يكون أنه عنده خلل في الطريق، يعني طريقة الدراسة فيها خلل. كما قلنا مثلا لابد أن يدرس بطريقة المراتب، بطريقة التدرج. فربما أحد الطلاب بدأ من المستوى العالي ولم يقرأ من مستويات الدنيا، أو بدأ من مستويات الدنيا ولم يتمم إلى المستويات العالية، ثم يقول لم أحصل على نتيجة. نعم، لأن الطريق فيه خلل. قد يكون هناك خلل في تصور النتيجة، يعني كما ذكرنا قبل قليل هو الغاية في ذهنه مثلا تبليغ الدعوة، ولكن هذه ليست غاية علم الكلام، فلن يصل إلى النتيجة التي هو ينتظرها. ولكن هو لو بحث عن نتيجة أخرى قد يكون وصل إليها وهو لا يدري النتيجة الحقيقية، وهي القدرة على حل الشبهات مثلا. قد يكون هو يطلب النتيجة الحقيقية ويطلب الغاية الحقيقية، لكن يطلب أعلى غايات هذا العلم. كما قلنا أصعب ما في هذا العلم هو الاشتباك مع المذاهب الفلسفية المعاصرة، فهذا يحتاج ربما 20-30 سنة. لكن طالب من 4-5 سنوات يقول لم أحصل على ذلك. نعم، لن تحصل على ذلك الآن، فربما هو حصل على نتيجة. أنت قادر على تقرير المذهب وقادر على تحرير مسائله وقادر على تحقيق بعض المسائل، ولكن لم تصل إلى المستوى الأعلى. وأخيرا ربما هو يتعجل النتيجة، يعني ربما بقي عليه 1-2 ليحصل على النتيجة فيتعجلها فيقف. لا، ينبغي أن يداوم ولا يقف.
MashaAllah. The parting advice of Dr. Hamza to us is that if a student find themselves in this situation, they should first assess, is there a deficiency in the path that got them here? Perhaps they started with books that are way beyond their level, and that was where the deficiency was. Maybe they started and they never started with the books that are on the earth, from the ground up. Or perhaps they started from the ground up, but they haven't reached the higher books that are necessary, that they haven't seen those horizons. So the second deficiency could be, again, what we spoke about earlier, that they misconceived the goal of that they had, because their goal was to be able to convey Islam to others, and they found that studying this science alone by itself didn't get them to that goal. And we've discussed earlier where that needs to be corrected. And lastly, the utmost goal that a student may have may be one that they have to be more patient for. Because if the highest goal of ilm al-kalam is to encounter and engage with and respond with philosophical ideas that are counter to it. And in order to do that, may take decades for a person to get to that level. And so a person should not want to rush the destination. And also, Dr. Hamza said that we may only be a year or two away from that level that we're trying to get to. So don't give up if we find ourselves in that situation. And for Dr. Omar, for parting advice for us in 2 or 3 minutes, we know that the whole system doesn't work without real benzene, a real juhud, sustained effort to get us there. But is that effort something we have to do alone or collectively?
Yeah, I would second everything that Dr. Hamza said. Incredibly important. Many times we want to study these advanced works, but then we don't follow the proper path, right? And then we end up, not achieving both. And so we have to get our, we have to understand what's called the order of learning versus the order of knowledge, right? Those are two important things: order of learning and order of knowledge, and they're usually inversely related. So, in order to get something may be advanced topic, but in terms of order of knowledge, it's very high and very advanced, but the order of learning, I mean, about that is inverse. You're going to start with the basic foundations until you arrive at that place. That's something that's really lost on contemporary students of Islamic sciences. So one thing that's lost is that they basically don't follow the correct order of learning. But the other thing is that they don't stick with the program when it's a good program, and they jump around from program to program, and then they end up not completing books and not completing the entire program, and then they end up not getting anywhere. But so just to answer the question directly, though, that I was asked, which is, yes, we should be there's not, we should be forming communities of learners, right? So students should form communities and where they are conducting discussions. That's very critical, right? Having discussions amongst themselves, mudhakara sessions, and then at the same time, they should also form communities and relationships with scholars. This is, to me, I think, a very critical point. Many times students will study and then they won't continue that relationship with the senior scholars. And when they start writing or they start teaching, they don't have that connection with senior scholars, and they don't seek their advice, seek their counsel, and if they are dealing with contemporary issues in particularly, or even issues within the science, advanced issues, they try to do this alone, and they don't seek their counsel and their deep understanding of senior scholars, and then they end up doing things alone, and then you see some pretty strange opinions and strange approaches coming about, what they call gharaib. You see them coming about. So forming communities of learners and communities of scholars is critically important, and those who are very accomplished, benefiting from each other and each other's expertise and each other's accomplishments is critically important. And you can only do that by forming communities. So forming strong communities is really, really important throughout, throughout your entire your entire academic career. You need to be forming these professional scholarly communities. And that's critical. I mean, that happens in all fields, right? You go to the, You look in the field of medicine, doctors, they have associations. They're constantly meeting every year. They're, sharing their research, getting critical feedback. Doctors do it. Folks in technology do it. Teachers do it. Business, people do it. IT people do it. Every field does this. They have professional associations and communities which they belong to and they benefit from. We should be doing the same thing. That is very, very helpful. And I'll end with that, inshallah. Yeah.
Allah yajzikum khair. Thank you so much, Dr. Omar and Dr. Hamza. I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience that's here. If not, we have some questions that we're getting online. Are there any questions that we have? I know we've been very patient and patiently listening. But, of the questions that have come in, one of the common questions that have been asked is about books, especially for those that are beginners. For those that have a background in philosophy, لهم خلفية في الفلسفة من الغرب, but they haven't studied علم الكلام. What book, is there a book out there that you would recommend for them to begin with? What would be the good first step, الخطوة الأولى للاطلاع على علم الكلام؟
يعني كتاب حول علم الكلام أو
حول علم الكلام
مستوى
وتطوره وتاريخه، ويعطي هذه الصورة كلية عن علم الكلام.
نعم، يعني وجود كتاب واحد جامع في هذا السياق صعب في الحقيقة، ولكن عموما الكتب التي بعنوان كتاب المدخل إلى دراسة علم الكلام للدكتور حسن الشافعي على سبيل المثال يكون جيدا، ولكن هذا الكتاب مضى على تأليفه ما يقارب 50 سنة ربما، فيعني في تطورات كثيرة لحقته، فلذلك أقول لا يوجد كتاب جامع واضح في هذا السياق. لكن عموما يمكن أن يجمع من عدة كتب وعدة أبحاث وعدة يعني حلقات على الفيديو أو كذا من هنا وهناك، يمكن أن يشكل تصور حول تطور علم الكلام وما شابه ذلك. في كتب مثلا باللغة التركية المدخل إلى الكلام أيضا بعنوان كلام جيرش وهكذا، أيضا يمكن يستفاد منها في هذا السياق. ولكن كما قلت من الصعب الوقوف على كتاب واحد جامع ويعطي تصور كامل، ولكن في طريقة أخرى وإن كانت أطول زمنا ولكنها أكثر دقة، وهي الحصول على التصور من خلال العلم نفسه. يعني من درس علم الكلام وابتدأ بالمستويات الأولى إلى المتوسط على سبيل المثال حصل على تصور جيد عن علم الكلام ويعني تطوراته ومدارسه وما شابه ذلك.
Dr. Hamza reminds us that there's really no book that gathers every single thing that one would want. It's best really actually studied naturally, and then that conception will come from actually just studying it. But if one were to do it, there are books that are out there. Say in Arabic, you have books by Sheikh Hassan al-Shafi'i. You have also in Turkish books that are introductory survey books, Madkhal Girish, into studies that help to start off a student. But ultimately, one can only piece them together, and the best way to do it is to really try to study the science. Perhaps, Dr. Omar, if there's a book that you recommend to students in English, maybe as a beginner step for college students that are out there, or students of knowledge, perhaps in English, that you would recommend. That seems to be a common question out there.
Yeah, if it's just to give a kind of a survey and an overview of Kalam theology, there's a really nice book on the Maturidi School of Theology by Sheikh Jabril Haddad. He's written a really nice book in English about the history of the Maturidi School, and he goes through who the imams are, and he goes through the various sub-schools, right, within the Maturidi School, and the authors, their books, and the contents, and it's a really good work I would recommend. But that's giving you a historical survey. It's giving you the historical development of the school, which is critical. It's very important to have an understanding of that. And that's in English. He wrote that in English, and so I would recommend that. And then, exactly as Sheikh Hamza said, that you have to. Right now, there's not one book that will really give one a complete understanding of, of the development of Islamic theology and its concepts. The best I would say is find an actual, find a mutakallim and sit down with him or her, and then you should be able to, learn directly from them, and they can take you through the historical development of Kalam, its major approaches and concepts and its themes. They are definitely articles that that are, one could. They are definitely like academic articles that exist as well, but some of those get quite advanced in terms of, because it's intellectual history, so they'll be dealing with intellectual history with specific ideas, and they're not basic ideas to Kalam. They're more advanced and very involved discussions and conversations that take place. So yeah, I think we kind of await for that book to be written, inshallah, English or Arabic. Yeah, Allahu Alam. Yeah.
Question that's been asked by students is, what is the balance for the student between revising by reading versus by speaking and engaging their colleagues. التوازن بين القراءة والمطالعة الكتب والكلام مع الزملاء في تطور مهارات في علم الكلام.
نعم، يعني لابد من المذاكرة سواء مع طلاب في نفس المستوى أو مع من هم يعني أعلى مستوى بقليل، يعني سبقوه في الدراسة بمرحلة أو مرحلتين، فيذاكر معهم هذه الكتب. لابد كلاهما يمشي معا، يعني الدراسة كلاهما يمشي في نفس الوقت، لكن الدراسة هي الأساس في الحقيقة وليس المذاكرة. يعني الدراسة أساس والمذاكرة مكمل لها. فيعني إذا أنا أعطي مثلا 10 ساعات للدراسة، أعطي 2 ساعات للمذاكرة على سبيل المثال، لكن كلاهما يمشي معا، لكن التركيز الأكبر على الدراسة.
So both of these have to operate at the same time simultaneously, but what are those both things? Both are actual close readings of and revision of reading, as well as being able to speak and to be able to discuss ideas. And Dr. Hamza encourages us to have colleagues that we work with that are both at our level and perhaps a level just a stage above our level. But in terms of how do we apportion the time, most of the time, if 80% of the time should be given to our reading and 20% to that mudhakara. And Dr. Omar, what advice would you give in that regard?
I mean, yeah, it really differs from person to person and where they're at. But, as was mentioned, is that the main focus should be on studying, especially in the beginning intermediate stages. You should really focus on studying and with, your particular instructor. But then, building on that, the idea of mudhakara sessions are critically important, and having discussions on topics are critically important as well. And getting supplemental readings, right? That's important. So something that I highly encourage when studying, even a particular matan in Aqidah, is to find nice articles or academic articles in English or Arabic that that go into some different dimensions of the mas'ala that you're reading from a historical aspect, and that always complements, right, one's studying. So, for example, like, mashallah, like even Sheikh Hamza Bakri's written a lot of journal articles that when studying Metin, I actually assign those, journal articles to read as well. And so then in English and Arabic, there's quite a lot there, and that one can access. But then, yes, having the mudhakara sessions, those are things that enhance and complement one's actual studies. So they are important, and how much time, that really depends on students and what institutions they're in as well. Yeah.
So much, Dr. Omar and Dr. Hamza. We're very blessed to be able to spend this time with you and to be able to hear your advices and your answers to our questions. We'd like to end with a dua. We kindly request Dr. Hamza, since you are in the middle of the room, and to في مركز الغرفة.
طيب، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد ما تعاقب الليل والنهار، وصل على سيدنا محمد ما سبح المسبحون بالعشي والإبكار، وصل على سيدنا محمد ما استغفر المستغفرون بالأسحار. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الأبرار وصحابته الأطهار، وسلم تسليما كثيرا يا رب العالمين. اللهم تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم، وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم، واغفر لنا وارحمنا وتجاوز عن سيئاتنا وكفر خطايانا يا رب العالمين. اللهم اغفر لنا ولوالدينا ولإخواننا وأخواتنا وأقاربنا وأرحامنا وأزواجنا وذرياتنا ومشايخنا ومن لهم حق علينا، ولسائر المؤمنين والمؤمنات برحمتك يا عزيز يا غفار. اللهم إنا نسألك تمام النعمة ودوام العافية وحسن الخاتمة والفوز بالجنة والنجاة من النار يا عزيز يا غفار. اللهم كن لإخواننا وسائر المستضعفين في الأرض يا رب العالمين. اللهم كن للمستضعفين المظلومين في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم تولنا برحمتك وتولنا بعنايتك وتولنا برضاك يا رب العالمين، واستعملنا فيما يرضيك، واختم لنا بالإيمان والإحسان يا رب العالمين. اللهم وألحقنا بالصالحين. اللهم تقبل منا بسر سورة الفاتحة.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Dr. Hamza. Thank you to Dr. Omar. Thank you to all of us that are here that made this a majlis. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.